History remembers him simply as Caesar, a name that embodies towering ambition, brilliant strategy, and a fall that has resonated through 2 millennia. From his position at the pinnacle of power, this military genius commanded the world as conqueror of Gaul, victor in civil war, and dictator of Rome. Revered by some as a necessary reformer, and reviled by others as liberty's destroyer, he was born to a noble but unremarkable family in a fractured republic, where he witnessed the bloody power struggles that would shape his understanding of power itself. The young Roman rose through a system where he learned Rome's essential truth: power belongs to the bold. Applying this lesson with ruthless efficiency, he excelled as an unrivaled commander, brilliant political strategist, and visionary ruler whose reforms outlived him by centuries. His extraordinary abilities transformed Rome from republic to empire, permanently altering the course of Western civilization. The saga of Julius Caesar begins with ambition and ends with a knife. But to understand the man, we must first understand the soil from which he grew. The Rome of the late Republic was no longer the austere state that had defeated Carthage and conquered the Mediterranean through discipline and virtue. By the 1st century BC, it had become something far more complex and infinitely more volatile than its founders could have imagined. For nearly 4 centuries, the Republic had thrived under a delicate balance of power that seemed as permanent as the 7 hills themselves. At its heart stood the Senate, 300 men of wealth and ancient lineage who guided policy and jealously guarded tradition. These senators elected 2 consuls to lead Rome for a single year, never consecutively, ensuring that no one man could accumulate dangerous levels of authority. Tribunes of the plebs served as the voice of common citizens, wielding sacred veto power to check senatorial overreach and protect the rights of ordinary Romans. This was a republic designed by brilliant minds to prevent tyranny through carefully distributed authority, with each branch of government watching the others for signs of excessive ambition. The system had worked magnificently for generations, producing leaders who served Rome rather than themselves. But beneath this elegant political machinery lay fracture lines growing deeper and more dangerous with each passing decade. Rome had conquered faster than it could adapt to the consequences of its own success. The wealth of empire flooded into patrician coffers in torrents of gold, silver, and slaves, while ordinary citizens watched helplessly as their small farms vanished. These ancestral holdings, worked by generations of the same families, were swallowed whole by vast estates operated by captured slaves who worked for nothing more than food and shelter. Veteran soldiers, men who had bled for Rome in distant lands, returned home after years of service to find themselves landless and forgotten. Their sacrifices, once honored by a grateful republic, now seemed meaningless in the face of economic forces beyond their control. The divide between patricians and plebeians, the ancient fault line that had always run through Roman society, widened into a chasm that threatened to swallow the republic itself. Power concentrated in fewer and fewer hands as the nobility, once servants of the state, increasingly viewed Rome as their personal inheritance to be exploited for private gain. Their mansions grew more opulent with each passing year, their banquets more lavish and excessive, while the forum echoed day and night with the angry voices of the dispossessed. The streets teemed with displaced farmers, unemployed artisans, and veterans who had traded their youth for promises that would never be kept. Into this cauldron of social tension stepped 2 men whose rivalry would forever alter Rome's destiny and teach the young Caesar lessons he would never forget. Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, uncle and enemy to the future dictator, embodied the opposing forces tearing at the republic's foundations. Marius, a new man of humble origins from the countryside, rose through sheer military brilliance to an unprecedented 7 consulships. Facing critical manpower shortages during the brutal war against King Jugurtha of Numidia, he made a revolutionary change that would echo through history. No longer would Rome's army consist only of property, owning citizens with a tangible stake in the republic's future. Now any citizen could enlist, including the propertyless masses who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from military service. They flocked to his standards in unprecedented numbers, seeing in military service their only path to land, dignity, and a secure future. But these soldiers, dependent on their general for everything, now looked to him for rewards rather than to the distant republic. Their loyalty shifted from abstract concepts of Roman glory to the flesh and blood man who would secure their retirement and prosperity. With this single reform, driven by immediate military necessity, Marius unwittingly planted the seeds for the military strongman who would eventually topple the republic he thought he was serving. His rival Sulla represented everything Marius was not: aristocratic by birth, conservative by instinct, and a fierce defender of senatorial privilege against popular encroachment. When civil war finally erupted between these titans, Rome witnessed horrors previously unimaginable in a civilized society. Proscription lists appeared on public buildings, naming enemies of the state whose property could be legally seized and whose lives were forfeit to any citizen bold enough to claim the bounty. Neighbor informed on neighbor in a frenzy of greed and revenge that tore apart the social fabric of the city. Roman blood flowed freely in Roman streets as the Republic devoured its own children. Sulla emerged victorious from this carnage and proclaimed himself dictator, but not for the traditional 6-month emergency term established by ancient custom. Instead, he claimed power without any time limit, ruling with absolute authority, while he ruthlessly reshaped the constitution to restore senatorial supremacy. Then, in a move that shocked Rome to its core, he voluntarily relinquished his unlimited power and retired peacefully to his villa to write memoirs and tend his gardens. But the precedent had been irrevocably set for any ambitious man with eyes to see one determined individual could seize absolute control, rewrite the fundamental laws to suit his purposes, and suffer no lasting consequences for overthrowing the established order. The young heir to the ancient Julian name observed these earth-shaking convulsions from his position on the periphery, learning invaluable lessons and calculating possibilities that others dared not even imagine. If Marius had shown how a clever general could harness the explosive power of the common soldier, Sulla had demonstrated how completely the seemingly immutable republic could be bent to serve a single iron will. These were lessons that would burn themselves into Caesar's memory, shaping every decision he would make in his relentless climb towards supreme power. The Julian family into which the infant Gaius was born on July 13, 100 BC, claimed descent from Iulus, son of Aeneas, who was himself the son of Venus. This divine lineage, however impressive in ancestral ceremonies, brought little practical advantage in the cutthroat world of late Republican politics. Though patrician in status among Rome's oldest nobility, the family's fortunes had steadily declined over generations. They occupied a modest home in the Subira district, a crowded, sometimes dangerous neighborhood far from the grand marble mansions that crowned the Palatine Hill. Here, among shopkeepers, artisans, and freed slaves, the future conqueror of Gaul spent his earliest years, absorbing the rhythms of common Roman life. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, had achieved some political success, reaching the rank of praetor, but never the consulship that marked true arrival among Rome's elite. He died unexpectedly when his son was just 16, leaving the teenager as head of his household with all the responsibilities that Roman law demanded. This early brush with mortality would become a driving force in the young man's ambition. Suetonius would later write of his determination to do something notable and worthy of memory, as if death's premature visit had awakened an urgent need for immortal fame. The dominant influence in his formative years was his mother, Aurelia Cotta, a woman of formidable intelligence and impeccable virtue whose family connections reached deep into Rome's political establishment. She instilled in her son the discipline that would later characterize his military campaigns and the social grace that would charm Rome's most sophisticated circles. Under her watchful eye, the young patrician received an education befitting Rome's ruling class, mastering Greek and Latin literature with equal facility. He studied philosophy under the best teachers money could secure, learning the Stoic principles that would guide his conduct through triumph and disaster. His training in rhetoric was particularly intensive, for in Rome, the ability to sway crowds and senate alike was the foundation of all political success. He practiced declamation daily, his voice growing stronger and more commanding, his gestures more precise and theatrical. The physical demands of public life received equal attention. He learned to ride with the skill of a cavalry officer, to swim in the Tiber's treacherous currents, and to fence with the deadly precision that might one day save his life in the chaotic milieus of Roman politics. Even in adolescence, His exceptional qualities were apparent to all who encountered him. Contemporaries noted his piercing gaze and natural authority, the way conversations seemed to bend toward him even when he spoke quietly. He showed a remarkable memory, a gift that would later allow him to dictate multiple letters simultaneously while conducting other business, and to recall the names and service records of countless soldiers under his command. The orator Apollonius of Rhodes, after hearing the young Roman's speeches, lamented that through this youth Greece would lose what remained of her intellectual glory to Rome's rising power. But these peaceful years of education and preparation were soon shattered by the violence convulsing Rome as competing factions tore the Republic apart. Sulla's march on the city in 82 BC cast a deadly shadow over the young man's future, transforming him overnight from privileged student to hunted fugitive. As nephew to Marius and son-in-law to Cinna, both leaders of the populist faction and bitter enemies of Sulla's aristocratic party, the 17-year-old suddenly found himself on the wrong side of a bloody political purge. The proscription lists posted throughout the city contained thousands of names, each representing a death sentence and a confiscated fortune. Sulla demanded he divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, as proof of his submission to the new order. Unlike many others faced with the dictator's wrath, who abandoned wives, friends, and principles to save their lives, the young Julian refused. It was his first significant political stand, and nearly his last. Stripped of his inheritance and priesthood, he fled Rome with a price on his head, moving nightly through the countryside to avoid the bounty hunters who scoured every road and village. For weeks, he hid in the marshy lowlands south of the city, suffering from the malarial fevers that would periodically plague him throughout his life. His mother's family eventually secured a pardon through their connections, with Sulla reportedly warning those who interceded, "Very well, take him. But know this, in this young man, I see many Mariuses." Whether apocryphal or not, the words proved prophetic. The dictator had recognized something essential about the youth he spared, an ambition that would not be contained by tradition, law, or the threat of death itself. These years of exile and constant danger left their mark on the young patrician's character, tempering his aristocratic breeding with hard, one-street wisdom. While his peers enjoyed the privileged path to power through family connections and inherited wealth, the young Julian learned to survive among common people, fishermen, farmers, soldiers, and traders. He developed the common touch that would later win him fierce loyalty from Rome's masses, understanding their hopes and grievances in ways that his more sheltered contemporaries never could. He witnessed firsthand the fragility of Roman institutions and the brutal reality of power stripped of constitutional niceties. The Republic's elaborate checks and balances, its ancient traditions and sacred customs, had proven powerless against a determined man with loyal legions. This lesson would echo through every decision of his later career. When Sulla finally stepped down in 78 BC, laying down his dictatorship in an unprecedented act that shocked the Roman world, the young nobleman returned to a city forever changed. The Republic still stood in form, its offices filled and its ceremonies conducted, but the substance had been fundamentally altered. Constitutional boundaries had proven permeable to those bold enough to cross them. Traditional restraints on ambition had been exposed as mere conventions, powerful only so long as men chose to respect them. The stage was set for a new generation of leaders who would test these boundaries even further, and among them, the young Caesar would prove the most daring of all. The young Caesar, who returned to Rome after Sulla's death in 78 BC, faced a political landscape that demanded careful navigation. The Roman Republic operated on a rigid hierarchy known as the cursus honorum, the course of offices that ambitious men were expected to climb methodically. First came the quaestorship, handling financial duties and serving as stepping stones to higher office. Next was the aedileship, responsible for public games and municipal functions that could win popular acclaim. The praetorship followed, offering judicial authority and the chance to govern provinces. Finally, the consulship represented the pinnacle of political achievement, wielding executive power over the Roman state. Most aristocrats spent decades ascending these steps, building networks, accumulating favors, and waiting their turn with patrician patience. Caesar possessed neither the inclination nor the financial resources for such a measured approach. His family's association with Marius had left him politically suspect, while his inheritance remained modest by senatorial standards. What he lacked in conventional assets, however, he compensated for with audacity, charm, and an intuitive understanding of Roman psychology. Rather than retreat to the exclusive Palatine Hill, where most senators resided, he established his household in the Suburra, Rome's bustling working-class district. This choice sent an unmistakable signal about his political sympathies and provided daily contact with the common citizens whose support would prove crucial to his rise. His strategy centered on spectacular displays of generosity that far exceeded his actual means. Where other politicians calculated their expenditures carefully, Caesar borrowed lavishly to fund public entertainments, private banquets, and personal favors that created networks of obligation throughout Roman society. Debt, rather than constraining his ambitions, became a political weapon that bound creditors to his success. His first major public statement came at the funeral of his aunt Julia, widow of the great Marius, breaking decades of enforced silence about his uncle's legacy. Caesar ordered the ancestral masks and military insignia of Marius carried in the funeral procession. The crowd's thunderous approval demonstrated that Sulla's attempts to erase Marian memory had failed completely. Common Romans still revered the general who had saved them from Germanic invasion and championed their political rights. When his young wife Cornelia died shortly afterward, Caesar delivered a funeral oration so eloquent and moving that it became legendary throughout the city. The sight of this handsome young patrician mourning his beloved wife with such genuine emotion captured the Roman imagination and established his reputation as a man of both passion and principle. Elected quaestor in 69 BC, Caesar served his mandatory term in Spain, where he reportedly wept upon seeing a statue of Alexander the Great. When asked why, he replied that Alexander had conquered the world by his age while he had accomplished nothing of significance. This anecdote, whether true or crafted, perfectly captured his burning ambition and impatience with conventional timelines. Returning to Rome, he sought the aedileship, the office that offered the greatest opportunity for public spectacle. His games and entertainments broke all previous records for extravagance, featuring exotic beasts, elaborate theatrical productions, and gladiatorial contests that kept the Roman populace enthralled for days. The costs were astronomical, but the political dividends proved invaluable. Every citizen who attended his games became a potential supporter, while his fellow senators took note of his ability to command popular enthusiasm. His personal life during this period reflected the same calculated boldness that marked his political career. His affair with Servilia, half-sister of the future assassin Marcus Brutus, scandalized conservative society while demonstrating his ability to attract Rome's most sophisticated women. More significantly, his relationship with Pompeia, granddaughter of Sulla, represented a strategic marriage that helped rehabilitate his family's reputation among former enemies. The union ended dramatically when the notorious Clodius was discovered disguised as a woman at the sacred Bona Dea festival held in Caesar's home. Though he refused to testify against Clodius during the subsequent trial, Caesar divorced Pompeia with the famous declaration that his wife must be above suspicion. This response demonstrated his mastery of Roman moral rhetoric while avoiding political commitments that might limit his future options. By 60 BC, Caesar had maneuvered himself into position for the consulship, but he faced formidable obstacles. The conservative faction, led by Cato the Younger, viewed his populist tendencies with deep suspicion and worked systematically to block his advancement. Meanwhile, two of Rome's most powerful figures found themselves similarly frustrated by senatorial opposition. Pompey the Great, fresh from his eastern conquests, sought land grants for his veterans and ratification of his territorial arrangements. Despite his military glory and immense wealth, the Senate's jealousy and procedural delays blocked his reasonable requests. Marcus Crassus, Rome's richest man, pursued tax farming concessions for his business associates while nursing his resentment at being overshadowed by Pompey's military achievements. The Senate's stubborn resistance to all three men created an opportunity for unprecedented cooperation. Caesar, with his political acumen and popular support, could provide what his future partners lacked. Pompey possessed the military reputation and veteran loyalty that Caesar needed. Crassus commanded the financial resources that could fund their mutual ambitions. Their secret alliance, later known as the First Triumvirate, represented a revolutionary departure from traditional Roman politics. Rather than competing within established institutions, they agreed to coordinate their efforts and share power among themselves. The arrangement remained carefully concealed from public view, presenting the appearance of normal political competition while orchestrating outcomes behind closed doors. Caesar's consulship in 59 BC revealed the triumvirate's true power as he pushed through legislation benefiting all three partners despite fierce senatorial opposition. When his colleague Bibulus attempted to obstruct proceedings, Caesar's supporters physically removed him from the forum, leaving Caesar to govern virtually alone. The year became known mockingly as the consulship of Julius and Caesar rather than Caesar and Bibulus. Most crucially, Caesar secured for himself the governorship of Gaul, a province that offered unlimited opportunities for military glory and financial gain. The conquest of Gaul would transform this ambitious politician into one of history's greatest military commanders while providing the resources and veteran loyalty necessary for his ultimate triumph over the Roman Republic itself. In 58 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar crossed into Gaul not merely as a Roman governor seeking glory, but as a man whose very survival depended on military success. His debts were staggering, his political enemies in Rome were circling, and his consulship had made him powerful adversaries who would prosecute him the moment he returned as a private citizen. The Gallic command offered salvation through conquest, plunder, and the creation of a veteran army loyal to him personally rather than to the Roman state. What followed was 8 years of systematic warfare that would transform Caesar from an ambitious politician into one of history's greatest military commanders while bringing untold suffering to the Celtic peoples of Gaul. Caesar's first campaign began not with Roman aggression, but with a migration crisis that threatened Roman interests. The Helvetii, a Celtic tribe from what is now Switzerland, had decided to abandon their mountainous homeland and migrate westward through Roman territory to settle in more fertile lands near the Atlantic coast. This mass movement of nearly 400,000 people, including women, children, and elderly, represented both opportunity and danger for Rome. Caesar recognized immediately that allowing such a massive tribal migration would set a dangerous precedent while potentially destabilizing Rome's Gallic allies. More crucially for his personal ambitions, it provided the perfect justification for military intervention. He moved swiftly to block the Helvetii at the Rhone River, forcing them to negotiate. When diplomacy failed, Caesar demonstrated the tactical brilliance that would characterize his entire Gallic campaign. At the Battle of Bibracte in 58 BC, he deployed his legions in the classic Roman formation, but adapted his tactics to counter Celtic fighting methods. The Helvetii fought with the fierce courage typical of Celtic warriors, but Roman discipline and superior equipment proved decisive. Caesar's detailed account in his commentaries describes how he personally rallied his troops when the battle hung in balance, throwing off his scarlet cloak and fighting alongside his men. This personal leadership style would become his trademark, earning him the fanatical loyalty of soldiers who saw their commander sharing their dangers. The victory was complete and brutal. Caesar claims that of the 368,000 Helvetii who began the migration, only 110,000 survived to return to their homeland. Whether these numbers are accurate matters less than what they reveal about Caesar's approach to warfare. He understood that in Gaul, reputation for ruthlessness could prevent future conflicts more effectively than mercy. Caesar's second major campaign revealed his strategic thinking on a grander scale. Ariovistus, a Germanic king, had crossed the Rhine and established himself in eastern Gaul with a growing army of German settlers. The Sequani, a Gallic tribe, had initially invited Ariovistus to help them against their rivals, but now found themselves dominated by their Germanic guests. Caesar recognized that Germanic settlement west of the Rhine posed a fundamental threat to Roman interests. If allowed to continue, it would create a Germanic presence in Gaul that could eventually threaten Roman territory itself. Moreover, the crisis provided another excellent justification for expanding Roman military operations. The campaign against Ariovistus showcased Caesar's psychological warfare tactics. Before the battle, Germanic warriors attempted to intimidate the Romans with their size, their war cries, and their reputation for ferocity. Caesar countered by addressing his troops directly, reminding them of Roman military superiority and promising rich rewards for victory. When some of his officers showed signs of nervousness, he publicly announced he would advance with only the 10th Legion if necessary, shaming the others into eager participation. The Battle of Vosges in 58 BC demonstrated Caesar's tactical flexibility. Against Germanic warriors who relied on individual prowess and intimidation, he deployed his legions in tight formation with overlapping shields and coordinated javelin volleys. The Germans, for all their individual courage, could not match Roman discipline and teamwork. Ariovistus fled across the Rhine, and Caesar established the river as Rome's northeastern frontier. This victory had consequences far beyond the immediate campaign. It established Caesar's reputation among both Gallic tribes and Germanic peoples as a commander who could not be defeated. More importantly, it demonstrated to his soldiers that their general could lead them to victory against any enemy, regardless of reputation or numbers. By 57 BC, Caesar's successes had alarmed the Belgian tribes in northern Gaul. These fierce warriors, whom Caesar himself described as the bravest of all Gallic peoples, formed a massive confederation to resist Roman expansion. The Belgae understood that Caesar's victories over the Helvetii and Ariovistus were merely the beginning of a systematic conquest. Their confederation included dozens of tribes capable of fielding over 300,000 warriors, making it the largest force Caesar would face in Gaul. The Belgian campaign revealed Caesar's mastery of logistics and engineering. Roman armies succeeded not merely through superior tactics but through their ability to maintain supply lines, construct fortifications, and adapt to local conditions. Caesar's legions could march further, fight longer, and recover more quickly than their enemies because of Roman organizational superiority. The siege of the Belgian stronghold of Sabis demonstrated these advantages. When the Nervi, the most warlike of the Belgian tribes, attempted to surprise Caesar's army while it was crossing a river, they initially achieved tactical success. The Roman baggage train was scattered, and several cohorts were thrown into confusion. For a moment, it seemed the Nervi might achieve the impossible and defeat Caesar's legions. But Caesar's personal intervention turned the tide. Seizing a shield from a fallen soldier, he rushed into the thick of combat, rallying his men by his presence and example. The sight of their commander fighting desperately alongside them inspired the Romans to superhuman efforts. The Nervi were virtually annihilated, with Caesar claiming that barely 500 of their warriors survived from an original force of 60,000. This victory broke Belgian resistance and extended Roman control throughout northern Gaul. More significantly, it enhanced Caesar's reputation for personal courage and military genius. His soldiers began to believe their general was invincible, a psychological advantage that would prove crucial in future campaigns. Modern historians estimate that Caesar's Gallic wars resulted in over 1 million deaths and another million Gauls sold into slavery. Entire tribes were exterminated or displaced. Ancient Celtic culture, with its rich oral traditions, artistic achievements, and complex social structures, was systematically destroyed across vast territories. Caesar's own writings reveal his calculating approach to this destruction. He understood that terror could be more effective than mercy in preventing rebellions. When the Aduatuci attempted to deceive him during negotiations, he sold the entire tribe into slavery as an example to others. When the Usipetes and Tencteri, Germanic tribes seeking refuge in Gaul, approached him under a flag of truce, he attacked their camp, killing men, women, and children indiscriminately. Even in Rome, some Southerners criticized this action as dishonorable. But Caesar defended it as necessary for Roman security. The wealth extracted from Gaul was staggering. Caesar's soldiers received bonuses that made them wealthy by contemporary standards. His officers became rich enough to purchase estates and political offices. Caesar himself accumulated enough gold to pay off his debts, finance his political activities, and eventually fund a civil war against the Roman state. But the true prize was not gold but loyalty. The veterans of the Gallic Wars became Caesar's most devoted supporters. They had shared hardships and victories under his leadership. They had seen him risk his life alongside them in battle. They knew their fortunes were tied to his success. When the time came to choose between Caesar and the Roman Republic, these battle-hardened soldiers would not hesitate. The conquest of Gaul transformed Caesar from a debt-ridden politician into the master of a military machine capable of challenging Rome itself. For 7 years, Caesar had methodically conquered Gaul, transforming scattered Celtic tribes into Roman provinces through a combination of diplomatic cunning and devastating military force. His legions had marched from the Rhine to the Atlantic, from the Alps to the English Channel, bringing Roman law and Roman taxes to millions of previously free peoples. The wealth flowing back to Rome was staggering, funding massive public works projects and ensuring the loyalty of Caesar's veterans through generous bonuses. Yet by 52 BC, the very success of his conquests had created the conditions for the most dangerous rebellion he would face. The spark came from an unexpected source. A young Arverni chieftain named Vercingetorix, whose name meant Great King of Warriors. Unlike previous Gallic leaders who had fought Caesar tribe by tribe, Vercingetorix possessed a strategic vision that transcended traditional tribal rivalries. He understood that only a united Gaul could hope to expel the Roman invaders, and he possessed the charisma and political skill to forge such an unprecedented alliance. The rebellion began in the winter of 53-52 BC, when most of Caesar's legions were dispersed in winter quarters across Gaul. Vercingetorix struck first at Roman settlements and Gallic collaborators, using terror tactics to discourage cooperation with the occupying forces. The massacres at Cinnabum and other Roman trading posts sent shockwaves through Gaul, demonstrating that Caesar's protection could not extend everywhere at once. More dangerously, Vercingetorix had learned from previous defeats, adopting a strategy of avoiding pitched battles in favor of guerrilla warfare and scorched earth tactics. When Caesar rushed north from his winter headquarters in northern Italy, he found Gaul transformed from a pacified province into a hostile territory where every village might harbor enemies. The Gallic leader's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity: deny the Romans supplies while harassing their columns with hit and run attacks. Vercingetorix ordered the burning of towns and crops throughout central Gaul, creating a wasteland that would starve the Roman legions. Only the fortified city of Avaricum was spared this destruction, against Vercingetorix's better judgment, when its inhabitants pleaded that its walls could withstand any Roman assault. This decision would prove costly when Caesar's legions stormed the city after a brutal siege, massacring its entire population of 40,000 as an example to other would-be rebels. The campaign's climax came at Alesia, a hilltop fortress in Burgundy where Vercingetorix made his final stand with 80,000 warriors. The site seemed impregnable, surrounded by steep cliffs and commanding views of the surrounding countryside. Caesar's response demonstrated the engineering genius that made Roman armies nearly invincible in siege warfare. Rather than attempt a costly direct assault, he ordered the construction of elaborate fortifications that would trap the Gauls on their mountain stronghold. His legions built not one, but two sets of walls, an inner circumvallation to contain the besieged Gauls, and an outer contravallation to protect against the relief army that would inevitably come. Between these walls, Caesar's 8 legions waited with the patience of professional soldiers, while inside Alesia, food supplies dwindled and desperation grew. The engineering feat was staggering: 11 miles of fortifications equipped with ditches, spikes, and defensive obstacles that turned the besiegers into the besieged when Gallic relief forces arrived. When the massive relief army of 250,000 Gauls finally attacked, Caesar found himself fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously. The battle raged for days, with Caesar himself leading cavalry charges at crucial moments, his scarlet cloak visible to friend and foe alike as he rallied his troops. The decisive moment came when Caesar led a final cavalry charge that broke the Gallic relief army, sending them fleeing in panic across the countryside. Faced with the starvation of his people and the collapse of Gallic resistance, Vercingetorix made the ultimate sacrifice, surrendering himself to save the lives of his followers. In a dramatic gesture that became legend, the Gallic chieftain donned his finest armor and rode out alone from Alesia, casting his weapons at Caesar's feet in submission. While Caesar was securing his final victory in Gaul, the political alliance that had made his command possible was disintegrating in Rome. The death of Julia in 54 BC had severed the family bond between Caesar and Pompey, removing the personal affection that had moderated their rivalry. More catastrophically, Crassus had perished at Carrhae in 53 BC, his head severed by Parthian cavalry and his legions destroyed in the Syrian desert. With Crassus dead and Julia buried, nothing remained to prevent the inevitable confrontation between Rome's 2 most powerful men. Pompey, now sole consul in Rome, began to view Caesar's continued absence with growing suspicion and fear. Reports from Gaul spoke of Caesar's growing wealth, his battle, hardened legions, fanatical loyalty, and his increasingly monarchical behavior among the conquered tribes. The Senate, long hostile to both men, now saw an opportunity to play them against each other, offering Pompey legitimacy in exchange for his help in containing Caesar. Conservative senators like Cato the Younger demanded that Caesar return to Rome as a private citizen, vulnerable to prosecution for his controversial consulship years earlier. Caesar's supporters proposed a compromise: allow him to stand for consul in absentia while retaining his command, thus maintaining his legal immunity. But Pompey, influenced by Caesar's enemies and perhaps jealous of his former ally's military glory, refused to support this arrangement. The political maneuvering grew increasingly desperate as Caesar's Gallic command neared its legal expiration date. Messages flew back and forth between Gaul and Rome, each side testing the other's resolve while preparing for what seemed an inevitable conflict. Caesar offered to dismiss most of his legions if Pompey would do likewise, but trust between the former allies had completely eroded. By late 50 BC, it was clear that one of Rome's greatest generals would have to destroy the other, and with them, the republic they had both sworn to serve. The die, as Caesar would soon declare, was about to be cast. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in January of 49 BC, he set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the course of Western civilization. The phrase, "the die is cast," echoed across the ancient world as Rome's most successful general turned his battle, hardened legions against the very republic he had sworn to serve. What followed was not merely a civil war, but a complete transformation of Roman society and the Mediterranean world. Caesar's march through Italy revealed the extent of his political genius as much as his military prowess. Rather than sacking cities and terrorizing populations as previous civil wars had witnessed, he pursued a policy of unprecedented clemency. Towns opened their gates without resistance, magistrates fled before his advance, and even Pompey's own supporters began to question their allegiance to a cause that seemed already lost. The speed of Caesar's advance caught everyone, including Pompey himself, completely off guard. Within 60 days, Caesar controlled all of Italy north of Rome, and Pompey found himself in the impossible position of having to abandon the capital without a fight. The great Pompey, conqueror of the East and Rome's most celebrated general, fled to Brundisium with whatever forces he could muster, then sailed across the Adriatic to gather strength in the eastern provinces where his influence remained strong. Caesar's entry into Rome was a masterpiece of political theater. He approached the city not as a conqueror, but as a liberator returning to free the republic from the tyranny of his enemies. He pardoned his opponents, respected the temples, and maintained the facade of constitutional government even while wielding unprecedented power. The Senate, depleted by the flight of Pompey's supporters, granted him the title of dictator, though he would later resign this position to assume the consulship in proper legal fashion. But Caesar understood that military victory in Italy was only the beginning of his struggle. Pompey still commanded vast resources across the Mediterranean, and his supporters controlled Spain, much of North Africa, and the wealthy eastern provinces that had funded his previous triumphs. The civil war would require Caesar to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, testing his strategic abilities on a scale that even the Gallic campaigns had not demanded. His first major challenge came in Spain, where Pompey's lieutenants commanded 7 legions of veteran troops. Caesar himself led a lightning campaign across the Pyrenees, demonstrating the same tactical brilliance that had conquered Gaul. At the siege of Alerta, he outmaneuvered his opponents through a combination of engineering genius and psychological warfare, ultimately forcing their surrender without a decisive battle. His clemency toward the defeated Pompeian forces again demonstrated his political wisdom, as many of these soldiers would later serve in his own legions. Meanwhile, his lieutenant Mark Antony held Italy against potential Pompeian counterattacks, while other subordinates secured Sardinia, Sicily, and the crucial grain supplies that fed Rome's massive population. The decisive confrontation with Pompey himself came in 48 BC on the plains of Pharsalus in central Greece. Despite being significantly outnumbered, Caesar's veterans proved superior to Pompey's hastily assembled forces, many of whom were Eastern auxiliaries unfamiliar with Roman tactics. The battle demonstrated Caesar's tactical evolution since his early days in Gaul. He personally commanded the cavalry on his right flank, anticipating and countering Pompey's attempt to outflank his position. When Pompey's cavalry broke under pressure, Caesar's fourth line of reserves swept around to attack the enemy rear, turning what might have been a costly frontal assault into a complete rout. Pompey's defeat at Pharsalus effectively ended organized resistance to Caesar's rule, but it also began the most fascinating chapter of his personal life. Pursuing his defeated rival to Egypt, Caesar found himself drawn into the complex political situation surrounding the young pharaoh Ptolemy Xanthuri and his sister Cleopatra V. Severii. The meeting between Caesar and Cleopatra has become one of history's most legendary encounters. The brilliant Egyptian queen, smuggled into his presence wrapped in a carpet, according to popular legend, immediately captivated the Roman general with her intelligence, wit, and political acumen. Their relationship was far more than a mere romantic entanglement. It represented a meeting of two of the ancient world's most sophisticated minds. Cleopatra was not simply beautiful, but one of the most educated and capable rulers of her era, fluent in multiple languages and deeply versed in philosophy, mathematics, and statecraft. Caesar's involvement in Egyptian politics demonstrated both his strategic vision and his growing confidence in his own destiny. By supporting Cleopatra against her brother, he gained access to Egypt's vast wealth and grain supplies, resources that would prove crucial for maintaining his position in Rome. The famous siege of Alexandria, where Caesar's small force held out against overwhelming odds while awaiting reinforcements, showed that his military skills had not diminished despite his political preoccupations. The birth of Caesarion, allegedly Caesar's son with Cleopatra, symbolized the increasingly personal nature of his ambitions. Here was a man who had transcended the traditional boundaries of Roman politics to forge relationships that spanned the Mediterranean world. His time in Egypt revealed a Caesar who was no longer merely a Roman politician seeking advancement, but a world ruler contemplating an empire that would unite East and West under his personal authority. The remaining campaigns against Pompey's surviving supporters were swift and decisive. At Zela in Asia Minor, Caesar's forces defeated Pharnaces Sicyon of Pontus so quickly that he dispatched his famous message to Rome: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The victory at Thapsus in North Africa eliminated Cato the Younger, Caesar's most principled opponent, whose suicide rather than accept Caesar's clemency demonstrated the irreconcilable nature of the conflict between Caesar's vision and traditional republican values. The final campaign in Spain against Pompey's sons proved the most difficult, requiring Caesar's personal intervention and resulting in the bloody Battle of Munda in 45 BC. By the time Caesar returned to Rome for his final triumph, he had not merely won a civil war, but had fundamentally transformed the nature of Roman power. His clemency toward defeated opponents, his integration of foreign allies into Roman society, and his personal relationships with rulers like Cleopatra all pointed toward a new model of leadership that transcended traditional Roman categories. The Republic's institutions remained intact, but they now served a single man whose authority derived not from constitutional position, but from personal achievement and popular support. Caesar had become something unprecedented in Roman history, a ruler whose power was limited only by his own vision and ambition. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome, he shattered more than just the law. He broke the fundamental compact that had governed Roman society for nearly 5 centuries. The Republic's greatest fear had always been the return of monarchy, the specter of kings that had haunted Roman consciousness since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud. Yet here stood Caesar, victorious in civil war, wielding power that no Roman had possessed since the legendary days of Romulus himself. Caesar's entry into Rome in 49 BCE was carefully orchestrated theater. Unlike Sulla's bloody return decades earlier, Caesar proclaimed clemency as his watchword. He pardoned enemies, recalled exiles, and promised restoration rather than revolution. But beneath this merciful facade lay a fundamental transformation of Roman governance. The traditional magistrates still held their offices, the Senate still convened, and the assemblies still voted. Yet everyone understood that real power now resided in a single man whose authority derived not from constitutional position, but from military might and popular acclaim. Caesar assumed the dictatorship, an ancient office designed for temporary emergencies, and began reshaping it into something unprecedented. Previous dictators had served for 6 months at most, addressing specific crises before returning power to normal magistrates. Caesar extended his dictatorship indefinitely, eventually securing appointment as Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. This wasn't merely a change in title, but a revolution in the nature of Roman authority itself. The ambitious reformer understood that lasting power required more than military victory. He needed to demonstrate that his rule could deliver benefits that the fractured republic could not. His reform program was breathtaking in scope and vision, touching every aspect of Roman life from the calendar to the constitution. The most visible change was his reform of the Roman calendar, which had become hopelessly confused through years of political manipulation. Caesar consulted with Alexandrian astronomers and created a solar calendar of 365 days with an extra day every 4th year. This Julian calendar, refined centuries later, remains the basis of our modern system. But calendar reform was merely the beginning of his transformative agenda. Caesar's domestic policies revealed a mind that thought beyond traditional Roman categories. He extended citizenship to entire communities in Gaul and Spain, dramatically expanding the definition of who could be Roman. This wasn't mere generosity, but calculated strategy, creating new constituencies loyal to their benefactor rather than the old aristocracy. He settled thousands of veterans in colonies throughout the Mediterranean, spreading Roman culture while rewarding military service. These colonies became centers of Caesarian loyalty, populated by men who owed their prosperity to their former commander. The urban plebs of Rome received even more direct benefits from their champion's largesty. Caesar expanded the grain dole, provided spectacular entertainments, and launched massive public works projects that employed thousands. His plans for Rome itself were grandiose beyond anything previously conceived. He envisioned draining the Pontine marshes, cutting a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth, and rebuilding Rome with unprecedented magnificence. The Forum Julium, his contribution to the city's architectural legacy, demonstrated the scale of his ambitions. Yet these reforms, however beneficial, came at the cost of traditional republican governance. The Senate, once the guiding council of a citizen republic, became increasingly irrelevant as Caesar's personal advisors assumed real influence. Magistrates found their authority circumscribed by the dictator's direct intervention in every aspect of administration. The assemblies still met and voted, but their deliberations had become meaningless theater when Caesar's will was already known. Most disturbing to traditional Romans was Caesar's growing adoption of monarchical symbols and behaviors. He appeared in public wearing the red boots and purple toga traditionally associated with kings. His statue was placed among those of the legendary kings of Rome in the Temple of Quirinus. He allowed, perhaps even encouraged, honors that elevated him above ordinary mortality. Caesar's relationship with divine honors reveals the complex psychology of absolute power. Initially, he may have accepted such honors reluctantly, understanding their political utility while remaining privately skeptical. But power has its own logic, and the man who had conquered Gaul and defeated Pompey found it increasingly difficult to accept ordinary human limitations. The Senate voted him divine honors typically reserved for gods, including a golden throne in the Senate House and a special priest to oversee his cult. His image appeared on coins, a privilege previously reserved for deceased heroes and deities. Most provocatively, he allowed himself to be hailed as the descendant of Venus through his supposed ancestor Aeneas. These divine pretensions horrified traditional Romans who remembered their ancestors' struggles against tyrannical kings. The Republic's founders had created elaborate checks and balances specifically to prevent any individual from accumulating such power. Yet here was Caesar, not merely holding supreme authority, but claiming divine sanction for his rule. His supporters argued that only such extraordinary leadership could address Rome's extraordinary challenges. The Republic had proven incapable of governing its vast empire effectively, they claimed, and Caesar's reforms demonstrated the superiority of unified command. But his critics saw something more sinister in his accumulation of honors and authority. They witnessed the systematic destruction of the institutions that had made Rome great, replaced by the whims of a single man, however capable. The tension between Caesar's undeniable achievements and his constitutional violations created an atmosphere of growing unease among the senatorial class. Many who had initially supported him as the lesser evil compared to civil war now questioned whether they had merely exchanged one form of chaos for another. Caesar seemed oblivious to these concerns, or perhaps he simply no longer cared about traditional sensibilities. His focus had turned to even grander projects, including a planned campaign against Parthia to avenge Crassus's defeat and add eastern glory to his western conquests. The Republic's institutions remained intact in form, but they now served a single man whose authority derived not from constitutional position, but from personal achievement and popular support. Caesar had become something unprecedented in Roman history, a ruler whose power was limited only by his own vision and the growing resentment of those who remembered when Rome was governed by laws rather than the will of one man, however extraordinary that man might be. As Caesar's Gallic command approached its conclusion, the Senate in Rome watched with mounting alarm. The young spendthrift they had dispatched to a provincial backwater had returned a conquering hero with immense wealth, popular acclaim, and a battle-hardened army loyal to him alone. The Roman historian Suetonius would later write that Caesar had rather not be first among the Gauls than second in Rome. Having achieved the former, he now set his sights unswervingly on eliminating the latter possibility. Events in Rome during his absence had shifted the political landscape dramatically, setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine not just his future, but the fate of the Republic itself. While blood soaked the fields of Gaul, the political alliance that had secured the conqueror's command was unraveling in Rome. The triumvirate, always an arrangement of convenience rather than conviction, had endured longer than many expected. But in the tumultuous summer of 54 BC, a critical bond was severed. Julia, daughter to one triumvir and wife to another, died in childbirth. Her infant son perished with her. The marriage had been political in conception, but had blossomed into genuine affection. Pompey, genuinely grieving, proposed burying his young wife in his family tomb. The Roman populace, however, insisted she be honored with burial in the Campus Martius, a distinction previously reserved for Rome's greatest public servants. With Julia's death, the family tie between the two rivals was broken. The triumvirate's third member, Crassus, still provided some equilibrium. But the following year brought fresh disaster when Crassus, seeking military glory to match his partners, launched an ill-conceived invasion of Parthia. At Carrhae on the sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia, his legions met catastrophic defeat. Crassus himself was killed, his head severed and used as a prop in a Parthian theatrical performance. According to legend, the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat in mockery of his notorious greed. The triumvirate was no more. Only two power centers remained in Roman politics: Pompey in Rome and his younger rival in Gaul. Between them stood a deepening gulf of mutual suspicion. The Roman capital, meanwhile, descended into unprecedented chaos. Street violence between rival gangs, led by the populist demagogue Clodius and the conservative enforcer Milo, made normal governance impossible. Elections were postponed amid bribery and bloodshed that turned Roman streets into battlefields. Citizens barricaded themselves in their homes as armed thugs roamed freely, settling political disputes with daggers and clubs. The Senate, desperate to restore order, turned to Pompey, appointing him sole consul, an unprecedented emergency measure that violated centuries of constitutional precedent. Pompey, once the triumvirate's military titan, had transformed himself into the Senate's champion and defender of constitutional norms. The same conservative faction that had once thwarted his eastern settlements now embraced him as a bulwark against his former allies' ambitions. As street violence culminated in Clodius's murder and the burning of the Senate house itself, Pompey was granted extraordinary powers to restore order, which he did with efficient severity. Public trials were conducted under military guard, and the rule of law was restored through the very military force the Senate had traditionally feared. The Gallic conqueror observed these developments from across the Alps with mounting concern. His political position was deteriorating precisely as his military situation finally stabilized. His command in Gaul would soon expire, requiring him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, where enemies eagerly awaited the opportunity to prosecute him for actions during his consulship years earlier. To secure his position, He needed to transition directly from his Gallic command to a second consulship without the vulnerable interval of private citizenship. Roman law, however, required candidates for consul to appear in person, an impossibility while he retained his provincial command. He requested a dispensation to stand in absentia, citing the precedent of Pompey's own extraordinary commands. The Senate, led by his implacable enemy Cato, refused with barely concealed satisfaction. Furthermore, they began discussing his recall and replacement in Gaul before his term was complete. The message was clear: return to Rome without your army and face political destruction, or retain your command in defiance of the Senate and become an enemy of the state. Seeking compromise, Caesar proposed a mutual disarmament. He would relinquish his provinces and legions if Pompey would do the same. This seemingly reasonable suggestion contained a crucial asymmetry that his enemies immediately recognized. Pompey, as defender of Italy, would always be able to raise new legions from Rome's vast population. Caesar, once separated from his veteran troops, would lose his only leverage and face certain prosecution. As tensions mounted through the winter of 50 BC, a crucial ally emerged in Rome. Mark Antony, newly elected tribune, used his constitutional powers to veto all measures against Caesar. But even Antony's protection had limits. When the Senate passed its final decree declaring Caesar a public enemy, unless he disbanded his armies, Antony and his fellow tribune Cassius fled Rome in disguise, claiming their lives were in danger. Their dramatic escape provided Caesar with the pretext he needed. The tribunes, sacred representatives of the people, had been driven from Rome by his enemies. On a cold January night in 49 BC, Caesar stood with a single legion on the banks of the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy. Roman law forbade any general from bringing armed forces across this modest stream. To do so was treason, an act of war against the state itself. His officers gathered around him in the darkness, understanding that their next decision would reshape the Roman world. Suetonius records his final words before crossing: "The die is cast." With those 4 words, Caesar committed himself and Rome to civil war. His veteran legions, hardened by 8 years of Gallic warfare, crossed the Rubicon in perfect formation. There would be no turning back. The Roman Republic, already weakened by decades of political violence and constitutional breakdown, would not survive the conflict that followed. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon marked not just the beginning of civil war, but the end of 5 centuries of republican government. The die had indeed been cast, and when it finally came to rest, Rome would be an empire ruled by emperors, not a republic governed by senators. The young patrician, who had once been held for ransom by pirates, had become the man who held Rome itself for ransom. The winter of 50 BC found Rome teetering on the edge of civil war, with the Senate's ultimatum forcing Caesar into an impossible choice. His trusted lieutenant Mark Antony, serving as tribune of the plebs, had used his sacred office to protect his patron's interests in the increasingly hostile political climate. When the Senate finally moved to declare the proconsul an enemy of the state, Antony and his fellow tribune Cassius exercised their constitutional veto, only to face physical threats from Pompey's supporters in the chamber. The violation was unprecedented. Tribunes had been considered sacrosanct since the early Republic, their persons protected by religious law and popular oath. Fleeing Rome disguised as slaves to avoid assassination, the 2 tribunes made their desperate way north to Caesar's headquarters in Cisalpine Gaul, carrying news of the Senate's ultimatum and their own persecution. This violation of the tribunes' sacred status provided the legal pretext the Gallic commander had been waiting for throughout the escalating crisis. He could now present his actions not as naked personal ambition, but as a righteous defense of the Roman constitution against a senatorial faction that had used violence against the people's elected representatives. On a cold January night in 49 BC, Caesar stood with a single legion on the north bank of a small stream marking the boundary between his province and Italy proper. The Rubicon was less a mighty river than a symbolic line in the sand, but crossing it with armed troops would mean irrevocable commitment to civil war against the Roman state. According to the historian Suetonius, Caesar hesitated briefly at this moment of supreme decision, weighing the consequences of the step that would transform him from proconsul to rebel. Then, uttering the famous words, "Alia acta est," the die is cast, he spurred his horse forward into the shallow waters that separated legal authority from revolutionary action. That momentous crossing on a winter night transformed not just Caesar's fate, but the entire trajectory of Roman history. The Republic had endured 5 centuries of trials, weathering external threats from Carthage to the Cimbri and internal convulsions from the Gracchi to Sulla's bloody dictatorship. Now it faced its gravest challenge, not from a revolutionary seeking to overturn the system entirely, but from a traditional politician using extraordinary means to preserve his place within it. As news of the Rubicon crossing reached Rome, panic erupted throughout the city's narrow streets and crowded forums. Despite his vast theoretical advantages in resources and manpower, Pompey had made woefully inadequate preparations for what now seemed inevitable. "I have only to stamp my foot in Italy," he had famously boasted to the Senate, "and legions will spring up from the soil." Reality proved far less accommodating than his confident rhetoric had suggested. Rather than defend Rome with the hastily assembled forces at his disposal, Pompey made the shocking announcement that the Senate and government would abandon the capital entirely. As Caesar's forces advanced rapidly southward through Italy, meeting little resistance, the defenders fell back toward Brundisium, intending to cross the Adriatic to Greece, where Pompey could mobilize his extensive eastern resources and client kingdoms. The psychological impact of this strategic retreat proved devastating to the Republican cause. For citizens who had been repeatedly told that the Republic faced merely a criminal adventurer with minimal support, the government's ignominious flight suggested something far more threatening was approaching their gates. Municipalities across Italy capitulated without resistance as Caesar's column approached, their gates thrown open by magistrates eager to avoid destruction. Former political opponents sent messages of support and submission, while even some of Pompey's own troops deserted to join the advancing force. The man Cato had dismissed as a dissolute spendthrift, the aristocrat rejected by his senatorial peers as a dangerous demagogue, the general whose Gallic conquests had been systematically belittled in Senate debates, now marched virtually unopposed toward the heart of the empire. Most remarkably, he achieved this conquest without executing a single Roman citizen or allowing his battle-hardened troops to plunder a single Italian town. This restraint, whether calculated or genuine, stood in stark contrast to the bloody precedents set by Marius and Sulla in their civil conflicts. As Pompey and most of the Senate sailed from Brundisium to Greece, their rival entered Rome for the first time in nearly a decade. The Eternal City had fallen without a fight to the man who claimed to be its defender against senatorial tyranny. The temples stood untouched, the citizens unharmed, but the Republic had suffered a constitutional wound from which it would never fully recover. Standing in the nearly empty Senate House before the handful of senators who had remained in the capital, the conqueror could reflect on his extraordinary journey from the Subura slums to supreme power over the Mediterranean world. But his victory remained incomplete, and he knew it. Across the Adriatic, Pompey was gathering his strength and that of Rome's eastern allies. In Spain, Pompeian legions controlled the wealthy western provinces. Africa remained firmly in Republican hands under Cato's stern leadership. The Civil War had only just begun, and with it would come the final chapter in the Roman Republic's long and tumultuous history. The winter crossing of the Adriatic had been audacious beyond reason, yet it was only the beginning of Caesar's most dangerous gamble. Stranded on the hostile shores of Epirus, with half his army still trapped in Italy, the self-proclaimed consul faced the full weight of Pompey's accumulated advantages. The Great One commanded not merely superior numbers, but the allegiance of Rome's most powerful allies. Kings from across the eastern Mediterranean had answered his call, bringing with them the wealth of centuries and the military traditions of Alexander's successors. Deiotarus of Galatia arrived with his fierce Celtic warriors, transplanted generations earlier but still deadly with sword and spear. The young Ptolemy of Egypt, despite his sister Cleopatra's recent troubles, had sent grain ships and gold to sustain Pompey's cause. Most significantly, the kingdoms of the East viewed this conflict not as a Roman civil war, but as a struggle between legitimate authority and dangerous rebellion. The two greatest generals of their age now faced each other across the windswept hills of coastal Albania, each seeking to impose his will through the ancient art of fortification. Caesar's engineers, veterans of the Gallic sieges, began their familiar work of encirclement, constructing a double wall of earth and timber that stretched for miles across the rugged terrain. The outer wall faced outward against Pompey's relieving forces, while the inner wall trapped the enemy army within an ever-tightening noose. But Pompey was no barbarian chieftain to be easily contained. His own engineers, trained in the sophisticated siege craft of the Greek world, countered every move with defensive works of their own. Where Caesar's men dug, Pompey's forces built higher ramparts. Where the besiegers attempted to cut water supplies, the besieged opened new wells. The contest became a deadly chess match played with the lives of thousands, each side probing for weakness, while winter storms lashed both armies with equal fury. For months, neither commander could gain decisive advantage, and the stalemate began to favor the defender. Pompey's control of the sea meant steady supplies of grain and reinforcements, while Caesar's men grew gaunt on half, rations and dwindling hope. The breaking point came when Pompey's scouts discovered a gap in the besieging lines where the fortifications met the sea. Under cover of darkness, veteran legions struck with coordinated precision, overwhelming the surprised guards and pouring through the breach like water through a broken dam. The battle that followed shattered Caesar's reputation for invincibility. His legendary 10th Legion, heroes of 100 Gallic victories, broke and fled before Pompey's disciplined assault. Nearly 1,000 of Caesar's men lay dead in the morning light, while Pompey's losses barely numbered in the dozens. Standing among the corpses of his faithful soldiers, the architect of Gallic conquest faced the possibility that his remarkable career might end in ignoble defeat on a foreign shore. His officers, their confidence shaken for the first time since Gaul, spoke quietly of negotiation and honorable surrender. But the man who had crossed the Rubicon possessed reserves of determination that his enemies consistently underestimated. Rather than compound his defeat by desperate measures, Caesar demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had made him master of Gaul. Abandoning his elaborate siege works, he led his battered army eastward into the mountains of Thessaly, seeking ground more favorable for the climactic confrontation he knew must come. Pompey faced a crucial decision that would determine the fate of the Roman world. His cautious instincts, honed by decades of successful campaigning, urged continued attrition warfare that would gradually bleed Caesar's forces to death without risking his own advantageous position. But the senatorial nobles who had followed him into exile possessed neither patience nor strategic wisdom. Cato the Younger, moral voice of republican virtue, demanded immediate pursuit and total victory over the man he viewed as Rome's greatest enemy since Hannibal. Marcus Bibulus, Caesar's old colleague and bitter rival, argued that further delay would only allow the tyrant to recover his strength and perhaps receive reinforcements from his supporters in Italy. Most persuasively, the younger senators who had abandoned comfortable lives in Rome for the hardships of campaign life grew increasingly restless with Pompey's defensive strategy. They had come to witness the destruction of Caesar's ambitions, not to endure endless months of uncomfortable stalemate in foreign lands. Under this mounting pressure, even the great Pompey began to waver in his strategic judgment. The man who had conquered the East and brought more territory under Roman rule than any general since the legendary Scipio found himself swayed by the impatient voices of his political allies. Perhaps, he reasoned, a single decisive battle would indeed end the civil war more quickly and with less overall bloodshed than a prolonged campaign of attrition. The stage was thus set for the encounter that would determine whether the Roman Republic would survive or perish, whether Caesar's revolution would triumph or collapse in the dust of a Thessalian plain. As summer reached its height in the year 48 BC, two armies converged on the small town of Pharsalus, carrying with them the destiny of the Mediterranean world and the hopes of millions who would never know their names. The dice of fate, cast so boldly at the Rubicon's edge, were about to reveal their final numbers. The severed head of Pompey Magnus arrived in Alexandria before Caesar himself, carried like a grotesque trophy by nervous Egyptian courtiers who believed they were delivering the perfect gift to Rome's new master. When Caesar's ships appeared on the horizon in October of 48 BCE, the advisors of young Ptolemy Exiri felt confident in their calculated gamble. They had eliminated Caesar's greatest rival and could now present themselves as valuable allies to the victor of Pharsalus. But as Caesar stepped onto the marble quays of Alexandria's great harbor, surrounded by the towering Pharos lighthouse and the gleaming facades of the world's most magnificent city, he carried with him expectations that would reshape the ancient world. The Roman general had come to Egypt pursuing Pompey, but he would leave having encountered something far more dangerous than any military enemy, a brilliant queen whose ambitions matched his own, and whose allure would prove nearly as compelling as power itself. Alexandria in 48 BCE represented the pinnacle of Hellenistic civilization, a city where Greek learning merged with Egyptian wealth to create wonders that dazzled even Romans accustomed to grandeur. The great library housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing the accumulated knowledge of the Mediterranean world, while the museum attracted scholars, mathematicians, and philosophers from every corner of the known world. Into this intellectual paradise had come the sordid realities of dynastic politics, as the teenage Ptolemy Sisu and his 21-year-old sister Cleopatra the Musu waged civil war for control of the richest kingdom outside Rome itself. The young pharaoh's advisors, particularly the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achillas, had driven Cleopatra into exile and now controlled both the boy king and the machinery of Egyptian government. When news arrived of Caesar's victory at Pharsalus, these courtiers faced a crucial decision that would determine not only their own survival, but the future relationship between Egypt and Rome. Their choice to murder Pompey revealed both cunning calculation and fatal misunderstanding of the man they sought to impress. Pothinus and his allies reasoned that Caesar would welcome the elimination of his rival and reward those who had performed this service. They failed to grasp that Caesar's clemency toward defeated enemies had become central to his political identity, and that the manner of Pompey's death would horrify rather than please the victor. When the small boat approached Caesar's flagship, carrying Pompey's signet ring and head, the courtiers expected gratitude and alliance. Instead, they witnessed Caesar turn away in disgust, his face contorting with what observers described as genuine anguish at seeing his former son-in-law and greatest rival reduced to a bloody trophy. Whether Caesar's tears represented authentic grief or calculated theater matters less than their political effect, as the Roman commander immediately established himself not as grateful petitioner, but as moral arbiter of Egyptian affairs. His decision to punish Pompey's murderers while honoring his rival's remains sent a clear message that Rome's new master would not be manipulated by provincial schemers, no matter how valuable their services might appear. Caesar's arrival in Alexandria, with only 4,000 men, might have seemed like vulnerability to the Egyptian court, but the Roman general understood that his true strength lay not in numbers but in the aura of invincibility he had cultivated through years of conquest. He established himself in the royal palace with the supreme confidence of one who had already defeated every rival and now represented the undisputed power of Rome itself. His demand that both Ptolemaic siblings appear before him to settle their dynastic dispute revealed the extent to which he viewed Egypt not as an independent kingdom, but as a Roman protectorate whose internal affairs required his approval. Young Ptolemy Xi arrived with full royal ceremony, surrounded by courtiers and displaying all the traditional regalia of pharaonic authority. His sister Cleopatra faced a more complex challenge as she remained in exile and her brother's forces controlled all approaches to Alexandria. The solution she devised demonstrated both the desperate creativity of her situation and the theatrical instincts that would define her legend throughout history. According to Plutarch's account, Cleopatra enlisted the help of a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus, who smuggled her past the palace guards, rolled inside a carpet or sleeping bag. The image of the queen emerging from this makeshift disguise directly into Caesar's presence has captured imaginations for over 2 millennia, though the reality was likely more practical than romantic. Cleopatra understood that her first meeting with the Roman commander would determine not only her political survival, but the future of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. By appearing before Caesar without the formal protocols that surrounded her brother, she positioned herself as the more accessible and cooperative of the 2 siblings, while simultaneously demonstrating the kind of bold initiative that Romans admired in their leaders. The 21-year-old queen who emerged from that carpet was no mere beauty relying on physical charms, but a sophisticated ruler who spoke 9 languages, had received the finest education available in the ancient world, and understood that her kingdom's survival depended on navigating the treacherous currents of Roman politics. What transpired in that first encounter between Caesar and Cleopatra remains shrouded in the romantic mythology that later generations would weave around their relationship. But the political realities were stark and immediate. Caesar found himself in the position of arbiter between 2 claimants to the Egyptian throne, each representing different approaches to the kingdom's relationship with Rome. Ptolemy XC, controlled by his advisors, offered the traditional model of Egyptian subordination, a wealthy client kingdom that would provide resources and support while maintaining the fiction of independence. Cleopatra presented a more complex proposition, a partnership between equals that recognized Egypt's unique position as both the richest prize in the Mediterranean and the heir to Alexander the Great's eastern conquests. The queen's intelligence and education impressed Caesar, who had always valued intellectual achievement alongside military prowess. Her fluency in multiple languages, her understanding of philosophy and mathematics, and her grasp of the broader strategic situation in the eastern Mediterranean marked her as a ruler worthy of serious consideration rather than mere patronizing tolerance. More importantly, Cleopatra understood Caesar's own ambitions in ways that the young Ptolemy and his advisors could not comprehend. She recognized that the victor of Pharsalus was not simply another Roman commander seeking short-term advantage, but a transformative figure who might reshape the entire structure of Mediterranean civilization. Their initial conversations, conducted in the royal palace while Egyptian civil war raged outside Alexandria's walls, laid the groundwork for an alliance that would scandalize Roman society and ultimately contribute to Caesar's downfall. But in those early days of their acquaintance, both ruler and queen focused on immediate necessities: the resolution of Egypt's succession crisis and the establishment of a stable government that could support Caesar's continuing campaigns against Pompey's remaining allies. The die had been cast not only at the Rubicon, but in the perfumed chambers of Alexandria's royal palace, where Roman ambition met Egyptian sophistication and the ancient world's future took shape through the meeting of 2 extraordinary minds. Modern romantic imagination has transformed the meeting of Caesar and Cleopatra into something from legend, but practical politics initially defined their relationship far more than passion. For Cleopatra, this battle, hardened Roman, represented her clearest path back to power in a kingdom where she had been reduced to smuggling herself to him in a carpet. For Caesar, this intelligent, cultured queen offered a far more manageable ally than her brother Ptolemy XC, who had already surrounded himself with anti-Roman advisors and demonstrated his hostility by presenting Caesar with Pompey's severed head. Their personal connection, whether immediate or developing, gradually over the following months, became inextricably intertwined with strategic calculations that served both their ambitious interests. The young Ptolemy XC, recognizing the clear direction of Roman favor toward his sister, fled the palace in dramatic protest, immediately inciting the volatile Alexandrian population against these foreign interlopers who dared interfere in Egyptian royal succession. General Achillas quickly mobilized the substantial royal army, some 20,000 battle-hardened former soldiers from Pompey's eastern campaigns who had settled in Egypt after years of loyal service. Suddenly, the man who had conquered Gaul and arbitrated Egyptian politics found himself besieged in the royal palace with minimal forces in a hostile foreign capital whose narrow streets echoed with angry crowds. Thus began the Alexandrian War, a grueling 9-month conflict that nearly ended the great conqueror's remarkable career in the perfumed chambers where he had expected to find only political solutions. Cut off from reinforcements by hostile forces controlling the city, his small force of perhaps 4,000 men held the palace complex and harbor against overwhelming numbers that seemed to multiply daily. The fighting quickly spread to Alexandria's magnificent harbor, where the Romans burned dozens of ships to prevent their capture by Egyptian forces, creating a spectacular but dangerous blaze. The fire leaped hungrily to shore, consuming part of the great library of Alexandria, a cultural catastrophe for which Caesar would be blamed by scholars for generations to come. Though modern historians continue debating the actual extent of this destruction, Caesar's tactical genius manifested itself in urban warfare just as brilliantly as it had on the open plains of Gaul. When the Alexandrians cut off the palace's freshwater supply, expecting to force a quick surrender, his engineers dug wells that miraculously struck fresh water beneath the salty ground. When enemy forces attacked by sea with their remaining fleet, Caesar destroyed their ships with carefully prepared fire ships that turned Alexandria's harbor into a blazing inferno. He captured the strategically vital Pharos Island with its famous lighthouse, one of the ancient world's seven wonders, only to nearly drown during a desperate retreat across the harbor when a small boat overloaded with fleeing soldiers sank beneath him in the churning waters. According to Suetonius, Caesar swam to safety with one hand held high above the waves, protecting his precious military commentaries from the sea that threatened to claim both his life and his literary legacy. The arrival of reinforcements from Asia Minor, led by Mithridates of Pergamum, finally broke the deadly deadlock that had trapped Caesar for months in this most unlikely of battlegrounds. In a brilliantly coordinated attack combining forces from land and sea, the Romans decisively defeated the Egyptian forces at the Battle of the Nile, ending Ptolemy Xti's resistance. The young pharaoh drowned while fleeing across the river, allegedly weighed down by the golden armor that marked his royal status but proved his death sentence in the muddy waters. With all opposition eliminated and Alexandria secured, Caesar placed Cleopatra firmly on the throne alongside her even younger brother Ptolemy Xiv, a nominal co-ruler whom the brilliant queen would easily dominate. More significantly for Caesar's personal future, the victory celebration evolved into a leisurely cruise up the sacred Nile on Cleopatra's royal barge, a floating palace of unimaginable luxury that showcased Egypt's ancient wealth. This famous journey, lasting according to some accounts nearly 2 months, marked a dramatic departure from Caesar's usual relentless military pace that had characterized his entire career. While Pompey's surviving forces regrouped in Africa under Cato and Scipio, while Rome itself struggled under Mark Antony's increasingly questionable administration, the conqueror of Gaul lingered in Egypt, genuinely enchanted by a queen who combined intellectual brilliance with ruthless political ambition. Cleopatra spoke 9 languages fluently, administered one of the world's wealthiest kingdoms with remarkable skill, and claimed direct descent from Alexander's general Ptolemy, while embodying the divine authority that Egyptian pharaohs had wielded for 3,000 years. She was not, contrary to later Roman propaganda designed to diminish her threat, merely a seductress using feminine wiles, but a shrewd ruler who recognized in Caesar her kingdom's best hope for maintaining Egypt's independence in a world increasingly dominated by Roman legions. For his part, the aging general, now in his 50s, balding and increasingly lined by decades of campaigning, found in Cleopatra a woman who genuinely matched his intellect and boundless ambition. Their relationship transcended mere romance to become a genuine partnership of complementary interests that would reshape the ancient world's balance of power. When Cleopatra bore him a son, Ptolemy Caesar, affectionately nicknamed Caesarion or Little Caesar, Caesar acknowledged the boy as his own, though he never formally legitimized him as heir to his growing empire. Their liaison scandalized conservative Romans who viewed such entanglement with a foreign queen as fundamentally contrary to republican values and dangerous to Roman independence. The extent of Caesar's future plans regarding Egypt remains hotly debated by historians seeking to understand his ultimate ambitions. Would he have attempted to rule as pharaoh, king in Egypt, while maintaining republican forms in Rome, creating an unprecedented dual system of government? Was Caesarion intended as heir to a vast Mediterranean empire that would unite East and West under a single dynasty combining Roman military might with Egyptian wealth? Or was this Egyptian sojourn merely a pleasurable interlude before returning to the harsh realities of Roman politics and continuing civil war? These tantalizing questions remained forever unresolved when urgent news finally broke through Caesar's Egyptian idol after 9 transformative months in Alexandria. Pharnaces, son of Rome's old enemy Mithridates, had taken advantage of the civil conflict to seize Roman territories in Asia Minor, threatening Caesar's eastern conquests. Pompey's forces in Africa grew stronger daily under capable leadership, while in Rome itself, Mark Antony's mismanagement had created dangerous political chaos that demanded immediate attention. Caesar's departure from Alexandria in the spring of 47 BC marked more than just the end of a romantic interlude. As his galley pulled away from the great harbor, leaving behind the pregnant Cleopatra and the intoxicating luxury of the Ptolemaic court, he carried with him experiences that would fundamentally alter his vision of power and governance. The farewell gift he left behind revealed both his pragmatic nature and his deepening commitment to Egypt's queen. 3 full Roman legions remained to secure Cleopatra's throne against both internal rivals and external threats, transforming Egypt into a Roman protectorate in all but name while preserving the fiction of its independence. This arrangement served Caesar's interests perfectly, providing him with Egypt's vast wealth while avoiding the administrative burden of direct rule over such a distant and culturally complex territory. But the real transformation had occurred within Caesar himself during those formative months in Alexandria. The man who had crossed the Rubicon to defend his dignitas as a Roman nobleman had experienced something unprecedented in his culture. For the first time in his life, he had lived openly as the consort of an absolute monarch, accepting divine honors in the Egyptian manner and participating in rituals that proclaimed his semi-divine status. The contrast with Roman republican traditions could not have been starker. Where Roman magistrates held power for limited terms subject to constant scrutiny and potential prosecution, Egyptian pharaohs ruled by divine right until death. Where Roman decisions emerged from complex negotiations between competing institutions, Egyptian royal decrees carried the force of divine command. Where Roman society celebrated the tension between different power centers as a guarantee of liberty, Egyptian civilization had flourished for millennia under unified royal authority. These experiences did not create Caesar's monarchical tendencies from nothing, but they provided him with a working model of absolute rule that functioned effectively in practice rather than merely existing as a theoretical possibility. The swift campaign against Pharnaces in Asia Minor that followed his departure from Egypt demonstrated that his military genius remained undiminished by months of royal luxury. His famous summary of this victory, Veni, Vidi, Vici, captured both the speed of his triumph and perhaps his new confidence in his own near-divine capabilities. But observers noted changes in his demeanor and expectations that went beyond mere military confidence. The Rome to which Caesar returned in autumn 47 BC bore little resemblance to the functioning republic he had left years earlier to pursue his eastern adventures. Mark Antony's mismanagement as his representative had allowed multiple crises to fester simultaneously, creating a perfect storm of social, economic, and military problems. The firebrand tribune Dolabella had revived radical proposals for debt cancellation, setting creditors and debtors at violent odds throughout the city and creating the potential for civil conflict within the civil war. More dangerously, veteran legions stationed in Campania had erupted in mutiny, impatient for the rewards and land grants they had been promised but not yet received. These were not raw recruits but hardened soldiers whose loyalty had been tested in countless battles, making their rebellion particularly threatening to Caesar's position. Beyond Italy's shores, Pompey's sons had successfully rallied substantial forces in Africa, allying with local kings and preparing to avenge their father's death in a final showdown with Caesar's regime. Caesar's initial response to these multiple crises revealed both his political sophistication and his evolving relationship with traditional republican norms. When he appeared before the mutinous legions in Campania, he employed a calculated insult that demonstrated his psychological insight into military culture. Addressing the soldiers not as mallets, but as quirits, ordinary citizens, he struck at their professional pride and martial identity with devastating effect. The veterans who had defied other commanders fell silent before this reminder that their status and honor depended entirely on their general's recognition. When they begged to be reinstated under his command, Caesar agreed with calculated reluctance, knowing he would need these experienced troops for the campaigns that lay ahead, while also establishing his complete authority over them. The social conflicts plaguing Rome required a more complex approach that balanced competing interests while maintaining his own political position. Rather than simply suppressing Dolabella's radical debt proposals through force, Caesar instituted moderate relief measures that addressed legitimate grievances while protecting property rights. He canceled accumulated interest on existing debts and allowed property to be assessed at pre-war values for debt settlement purposes, a compromise that satisfied the moderate majority while alienating extremists on both sides. This middle path reflected Caesar's growing confidence in his ability to impose solutions through personal authority, rather than the traditional republican process of extended debate and negotiation. With domestic matters temporarily stabilized, he turned his attention to the final military threat posed by the republican forces gathering in Africa under Cato, Scipio, and other die-hard opponents. The Senate had granted him the title of dictator for 1 year, providing legal cover for his extraordinary powers while maintaining the fiction that his authority remained temporary and constitutional. The African campaign that followed would prove to be both his most challenging military undertaking since Gaul and the final demonstration of his evolution from republican general to something approaching an absolute ruler. The terrain and tactics of North African warfare tested his adaptability, while the political aftermath would reveal how completely his experiences in Egypt had transformed his understanding of power and its proper exercise. Caesar's comment about Cato revealed the complex psychology of absolute power confronting principled opposition. Cato, I begrudge you your death as you begrudged me the opportunity to spare your life, he reportedly said, reflecting genuine respect for an opponent whose incorruptible defense of republican principles represented everything lacking in Rome's compromised political class. This wasn't mere political theater, but authentic recognition that Cato's suicide had denied Caesar something he desperately craved: the validation that came from converting his most implacable enemy. Returning to Rome in July 46 BC, the dictator orchestrated 4 consecutive triumphs for victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. The unprecedented spectacle lasted days, with captured treasures, exotic animals, and defeated enemies paraded through streets lined with cheering crowds. Notably absent were Roman citizens among the captives, a deliberate choice that acknowledged the civil war's sensitive nature, even in celebration. Soldiers marched behind their general's chariot, singing ribald verses mocking his personal habits and alleged affairs, a traditional practice meant to ward off divine jealousy by tempering glory with humiliation. Yet amid the celebration, Romans glimpsed moments that hinted at monarchical aspirations. When the dictator failed to rise as the Senate approached during ceremonies, it provoked immediate whispers of royal ambition. His supporters claimed he suffered a seizure, the falling sickness that occasionally afflicted him throughout his life. Whether physical ailment or calculated insult, the incident damaged his carefully cultivated image as first among equals rather than aspiring king. Now secure in power, Caesar turned to governing with the same systematic approach he had applied to conquering Gaul. His reforms addressed fundamental problems that the Senate had neglected for generations, while the Republic slowly collapsed under the weight of its own success. To reduce urban unemployment that had created dangerous masses of idle citizens, he established overseas colonies for 80 Zalozan veterans and poor citizens. These settlements served multiple purposes: reducing pressure on Rome's grain supply, spreading Roman culture throughout the provinces, and creating loyal communities bound to their founder. To address Rome's chaotic calendar, which had drifted far from the solar year due to political manipulation by priests, he introduced the Julian calendar designed by Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes. This calendar would remain the European standard until the 16th century AD, demonstrating how Caesar's practical reforms outlasted his political innovations. He reformed the grain dole to prevent abuse, launched ambitious building projects to improve infrastructure while creating jobs, extended citizenship to doctors and teachers regardless of origin, and reorganized municipal administration throughout Italy. These practical measures revealed his vision of Rome not merely as conqueror of the Mediterranean, but as its civilizing administrator, transforming conquest into integration. Most controversial was his restructuring of the Senate itself, the institution that had governed Rome for centuries. The civil wars had depleted the traditional body, with many senators dead or in exile, creating both opportunity and necessity for radical change. He expanded membership from 600 to 900, including not just Italians but provincial elites from Gaul and Spain whom he had conquered and now sought to incorporate. Traditionalists fumed at the presence of former enemies and barbarians in Rome's most exclusive assembly. One popular joke asked for directions to the Senate House, claiming new members from Gaul couldn't find it. For supporters, these changes represented necessary modernization of institutions that had failed to evolve with Rome's expansion from city-state to world empire. For opponents, they constituted deliberate dilution of senatorial authority, creating a body too large to effectively oppose the dictator and too dependent on his patronage to function independently. Perhaps most telling was his treatment of former opponents after Thapsus. Most surviving Pompeians accepted his clemency and returned to public life, though without their former influence or independent power base. His policy of reconciliation, captured in the phrase, "Let this be the end," seemed genuine in its desire to heal Rome's wounds. Yet the underlying message was unmistakably clear. The Republic would continue in form, but genuine opposition would not be tolerated. This contradictory approach, maintaining republican institutions while emptying them of independent authority, characterized his entire rule. He accepted election as consul alongside carefully selected colleagues who posed no threat to his supremacy. He permitted the Senate to meet and pass decrees, though meaningful decisions were made in his private consultations with trusted advisors. He allowed elections to proceed, though his recommendations invariably prevailed and opposition candidates found themselves mysteriously disadvantaged. As the ancient historian Cassius Dio observed, Rome was in name a republic, but in fact Caesar had become an absolute ruler who governed through the fiction of traditional institutions. Fresh conflict interrupted these domestic arrangements when disturbing news arrived that Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, had raised new forces in Spain with surprising success. The younger generation of Pompeians had learned from their father's mistakes, adopting Caesar's own tactics of rapid movement and local recruitment while appealing to Spanish tribes' desire for independence. Leaving trusted deputies to administer Rome, the dictator departed for his final military campaign in November 46 BC, determined to extinguish the last embers of organized resistance to his rule. The Spanish campaign culminated at Munda in March 45 BC, where Caesar faced perhaps his most desperate battle since the early days of the Gallic Wars. The fighting grew so intense that he reportedly dismounted, seized a shield, and advanced to the front lines, shouting, "Do you mean to hand over your general to boys?" Of his veterans, shamed by this display and inspired by his personal courage, redoubled their efforts and eventually broke the enemy line after hours of savage combat. 30,000 Pompeians perished in the slaughter that followed, effectively ending organized resistance to Caesar's rule. The victory at Munda marked not just military triumph, but the complete transformation of the Roman world, with one man's will now supreme from Britain to Egypt. The blood-soaked fields of Munda had witnessed the final collapse of republican resistance, including the death of Gnaeus Pompey, though his brother Sextus managed to escape to continue his defiant resistance at sea. The victory at Munda marked the definitive end of organized opposition to Caesar's rule, a moment that would forever change the trajectory of Roman civilization. When news of this decisive triumph reached Rome, the Senate, eager to demonstrate their loyalty to the victorious general, voted him unprecedented honors that would have shocked their ancestors. The title of Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for Life, shattered centuries of constitutional tradition that had limited such emergency powers to 6 months at most. A golden throne was installed in the Senate House, elevating Caesar above his fellow senators in the most literal sense possible. His statue was placed among those of the ancient kings of Rome, a symbolic gesture that spoke volumes about his evolving status in the Roman hierarchy. Most remarkably, his image appeared on Roman coins while he still lived, the first mortal Roman to receive this honor previously reserved for gods and mythical figures from Rome's legendary past. His fifth and final triumph, celebrating the Spanish victory, proved controversial even among his most devoted supporters. Unlike his previous triumphs over foreign enemies like the Gauls or Egyptians, this celebration commemorated victory over Roman citizens, a distinction that had been carefully observed in all prior celebrations. The spectacle left many observers with the uncomfortable feeling that they were witnessing not the culmination of civil war, but rather the celebration of its architect. As summer turned to autumn in 45 BC, the conqueror of Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, Africa, and Spain stood at the absolute pinnacle of earthly power. All significant military forces throughout the Mediterranean world answered to him alone, their loyalty secured through years of shared victories and generous rewards. The Senate functioned as his instrument rather than serving as the constitutional check it had been designed to be by Rome's founders. Even the calendar itself had been reformed according to his personal decree, with the month of Quinctilis renamed Julius in his honor, ensuring his name would be spoken by every Roman for generations to come. Yet despite these overwhelming achievements, his ultimate triumph remained frustratingly incomplete. He had successfully won absolute power through military genius and political cunning, but he had not yet resolved the fundamental question that would determine Rome's future. Would the Republic eventually return to genuine republican government under traditional constitutional constraints, or would it transform into some entirely new political form better suited to administering a vast empire stretching from Britain to Egypt? His own intentions regarding this crucial question remained deliberately ambiguous, perhaps reflecting his understanding that premature clarity might provoke the very opposition he sought to avoid. While he consistently rejected the title of king when offered by enthusiastic supporters, he simultaneously accumulated powers and honors that were functionally indistinguishable from absolute monarchy. As he prepared for his next grand project, a massive military campaign against Parthia designed to avenge Crassus's humiliating defeat and extend Roman power to India, fate was quietly preparing to intervene in the most dramatic way possible. Among his pardoned enemies and seemingly loyal supporters, a deadly conspiracy was forming in the shadows of the Forum. Men who owed their very lives to his celebrated policy of clemency were secretly plotting to kill the man who had spared them. Their motivation was not revenge for what he had already accomplished, but rather fear of what they believed he was destined to become. The victor of a dozen pitched battles, conqueror of more than 1 million square miles of territory, and undisputed master of Rome itself, now faced his greatest and most complex challenge: the art of governance. Military conquest, for all its inherent complexity and danger, ultimately follows certain predictable rules and patterns that Caesar had mastered through years of experience. Politics in a republic that was rapidly transitioning toward monarchy presented far more subtle hazards and required entirely different skills. Having achieved supreme power through force of arms and political maneuvering, the crucial question that would determine his legacy remained unanswered. What exactly would he do with that power? The final months of 45 BC witnessed the dictator Perpetuo unveiling an extraordinarily ambitious agenda for completely reshaping the Roman state according to his personal vision. He initiated a comprehensive census of the entire republic, the first truly accurate accounting of Rome's population, territories, and available resources in generations. He commissioned teams of skilled Greek surveyors to create a complete map of the empire and directed them to measure all major roads radiating from Rome, creating a geographic understanding that would greatly facilitate future administration. His massive building programs were simultaneously transforming the capital's physical appearance while addressing urgent practical needs that previous governments had neglected. He ordered the draining of the disease-ridden Pontine marshes to create valuable farmland and significantly reduce the malarial infections that plagued central Italy. He expanded the Roman Forum with a magnificent new plaza dominated by an impressive temple dedicated to Venus Genitrix, the divine ancestress of the Julian family. He planned a massive public library that would be supervised by the distinguished scholar Varro, making Greek and Roman learning accessible to educated citizens. Most ambitiously of all, he initiated detailed plans to divert the mighty Tiber River itself to create a new deep water port at Ostia, a monumental engineering project that would only be completed generations later under the emperors. These practical improvements clearly reflected Caesar's fundamentally pragmatic approach to wielding power, emphasizing concrete benefits for ordinary citizens rather than merely accumulating symbolic authority. Yet alongside these genuinely useful projects came increasingly monarchical displays that made many Romans profoundly uncomfortable. He began appearing in public wearing the elaborate triumphal regalia that had traditionally been reserved for single-day victory celebrations. His portrait appeared on coins bearing titles and symbols that had previously been associated exclusively with kingship and divine authority. His statue stood prominently among those of the ancient kings of Rome, bearing the provocative inscription, "To the unconquerable God." The Senate, now expanded with his supporters and thoroughly intimidated by his power, had become merely an instrument of his personal will rather than the deliberative body envisioned by the Constitution. He received foreign envoys while seated on his golden throne, refusing to rise even when the entire Senate entered his presence, an incident that, according to Suetonius, aroused such widespread indignation that it was specifically listed among the grievances later cited by his assassins. When Mark Antony publicly offered him a royal diadem during the Lupercalia festival in February 44 BC, Caesar theatrically refused it. Though sharp-eyed critics noted that his refusal seemed carefully rehearsed, as if he were testing public reaction to potential kingship. Caesar's legislative program revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of his rule, a careful balance between republican traditions and monarchical innovation that satisfied no one completely while advancing his vision of Rome's imperial destiny. His reforms addressed genuine structural problems that had plagued the Republic for generations. He limited jury service to senators and equites, removing the chaotic influence of popular assemblies that had often been manipulated by demagogues and mob violence. Provincial governors now faced strict term limits, preventing the entrenchment of corruption that had allowed men like Verres to plunder Sicily with impunity for years. Standardized administrative practices across Italy brought efficiency to a system previously marked by local variations and arbitrary enforcement. Professional guilds received regulation ensuring consistent public services, from bread distribution to aqueduct maintenance. Each measure addressed legitimate concerns raised by reformers for decades. Yet each also concentrated authority in Caesar's hands, reducing the traditional autonomy of aristocratic families who had governed Rome for centuries. The most controversial innovation involved expanding Roman citizenship and Senate membership to include provincial elites, particularly from Gaul and Spain. These new senators, wearing unfamiliar togas and speaking Latin with foreign accents, represented Caesar's revolutionary vision of Rome as the center of a unified Mediterranean civilization, rather than merely the conqueror of subject peoples. Critics mockingly called them barbarians in Roman dress, men who had never walked the forum or understood the subtle protocols of senatorial debate. Yet this inclusive approach secured unwavering provincial loyalty while systematically diluting the power of old Roman families, a policy that was simultaneously progressive and ruthlessly self-serving. His economic reforms proved equally double-edged, attempting to navigate between radical demands and conservative resistance. He addressed Rome's crushing debt crisis through partial cancellation, providing relief to desperate debtors while respecting fundamental property rights. This moderate approach disappointed radicals who demanded complete debt abolition while alienating wealthy creditors who faced significant financial losses. New colonies for veterans and the urban poor relieved dangerous social pressure in Rome while creating loyal Roman enclaves throughout the Mediterranean, each settlement serving as both reward for service and strategic outpost for future expansion. Currency reform established consistent standards across the empire, facilitating trade and commerce while increasing central control over money supply, a power that had previously been distributed among various magistrates and provincial authorities. In his personal style, Caesar maintained calculated informality while wielding absolute power with unprecedented scope. He dined regularly with citizens from all social classes, granted ready access to ordinary petitioners seeking justice or favor, and displayed remarkable leniency toward critics, even allowing Cicero to publish a eulogy for Cato without facing reprisal. This accessibility created an image of the benevolent ruler who remained connected to common Roman concerns despite his elevated position. Yet he simultaneously required all senators to take a binding oath supporting his actions, both past and future, a demand that made genuine constitutional governance impossible by preventing any meaningful opposition or debate. His religious policy revealed similar tensions between public piety and private skepticism. Though holding the sacred position of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the Roman state religion, he displayed notably irreligious views in private conversations. According to shocked contemporaries, he openly questioned beliefs about the afterlife during a Senate debate, suggesting that death was merely the end of consciousness rather than a transition to divine judgment. Yet he simultaneously cultivated divine associations for political purposes, emphasizing his family's mythical descent from Venus and accepting statues that depicted him with godlike attributes in temples across the empire. This complex approach reflected genuine uncertainty about Rome's political future and his own role within it. The old republic had demonstrably failed, its institutions proving inadequate for governing a vast empire while preventing the civil conflicts that had torn Roman society apart for generations. Yet no clear constitutional alternative had emerged from centuries of political experimentation. Caesar appeared to be testing boundaries constantly, experimenting with forms of governance that preserved familiar republican structures while concentrating effective authority in a single ruler who could act decisively without endless senatorial debate. By early 44 BC, his position seemed absolutely unassailable to both supporters and opponents. The Senate had declared him dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, abandoning even the pretense of temporary emergency powers that had traditionally justified such appointments. His statue stood prominently in the temple of Quirinus bearing the inscription, "To the Invincible God," a divine honor unprecedented for any living Roman. Coins throughout the empire bore his portrait, an honor previously reserved exclusively for deities and abstract personifications of Roman virtues. Foreign kings sent elaborate embassies addressing him with royal titles, acknowledging his effective status as monarch of the Mediterranean world. His word constituted law without appeal or review, making him the sole source of legal authority for 60 million subjects. As winter turned to spring, he finalized ambitious plans for his next great venture, a massive eastern campaign against the Parthian Empire that would dwarf even his conquest of Gaul in scope and significance. This expedition would avenge Crassus's humiliating defeat at Carrhae, secure Rome's vulnerable eastern frontier, and potentially extend Roman territory as far as India, fulfilling Alexander's dream of eastern conquest. His military preparations demonstrated characteristic meticulous attention to detail. 16 legions and 10,000 cavalry would accompany him on a campaign expected to last at least 3 years, requiring unprecedented logistical coordination across thousands of miles of hostile territory. Before departing, he arranged comprehensive administration during his extended absence through appointments that revealed the monarchical nature of his regime. Key supporters received positions in major offices for years in advance, an unprecedented arrangement that effectively suspended electoral competition and reduced the consulship to administrative appointment. Mark Antony would serve as consul, Lepidus as master of horse, and various loyalists as praetors, while the expanded Senate, packed with provincial appointees and pardoned opponents, would provide an appearance of constitutional legitimacy for decisions already made. The imminent departure also necessitated addressing succession, implicitly acknowledging that his position transcended traditional republican magistracies. His grand-nephew and adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus, would remain in Rome, continuing his education while being gradually introduced to the complexities of imperial administration that would soon become his inheritance. Other young men of ability, including Marcus Junius Brutus, whose life he had spared at Pharsalus, received positions of responsibility, creating a cadre of potential successors should he fall in battle. What remains disputed is whether he intended permanent monarchy or merely extended emergency powers. His admirers argued he planned to restore genuine republican governance once institutions had been reformed and external threats neutralized. His critics saw in every action evidence of insatiable ambition for permanent royal power. The answer likely lies somewhere between a transitional authority that would eventually institutionalize itself as a constitutional monarchy, preserving republican forms while establishing dynastic succession. We will never know for certain. In the Curia of Pompey, on the Ides of March 44 BC, 60 senators, many of them beneficiaries of his clemency, ended these ambiguities with their daggers. The man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and transformed Rome's governance died at the foot of Pompey's statue, his plans for Parthian conquest and constitutional reform dying with him. In his final moments, according to ancient sources, he drew his toga over his face when he recognized Brutus among the assassins, uttering in Greek, "You too, my child," words immortalized by Shakespeare as "Eat too, brute." Whether expressing paternal disappointment or merely dignity in death, these final words captured the personal betrayal that paralleled Rome's political tragedy. The Republic had killed its most capable son only to discover that the wounds inflicted during decades of civil strife could not be healed by a single act of violence, however dramatic. The conspirators who struck 23 blows against a single man failed to understand that they attacked not merely a dictator, but a system that had evolved beyond traditional republican constraints. They killed a man, but not the forces that had propelled him to power. Forces that would soon propel his heir toward even more thoroughgoing transformation of Roman governance. Beyond the general who conquered Gaul, beyond the dictator who transformed Rome, stood a human being of extraordinary complexity. To understand the historical impact, we must understand the man who shaped events as much as he was shaped by them. Physically, he presented a study in contrasts. Tall and slender by Roman standards, with fair skin and piercing dark eyes, he combined aristocratic refinement with remarkable physical endurance. Despite his lifelong battle with epilepsy, the falling sickness that occasionally struck him in moments of stress, he routinely outmarched his legions, swam rivers in full armor, and rode for days with minimal rest. Suetonius notes that he often dictated letters to 2 or more secretaries simultaneously while traveling, demonstrating exceptional mental agility. His famous vanity regarding his thinning hair became the subject of jokes, even among his own troops, who sang ribald verses about their bald adulterer during triumphal processions. He combed his remaining strands forward to conceal his receding hairline, and received with evident pleasure the Senate's decree allowing him to permanently wear a laurel wreath, ostensibly to honor his victories, but conveniently concealing his baldness. When offered a choice between a triumph or consulship early in his career, he chose the consulship, reportedly saying, "Better to be first in authority among the living than first in a procession once." This vanity extended beyond appearance to historical legacy. From his earliest campaigns, he meticulously documented his achievements in commentaries written in lucid, elegant Latin. These works, particularly the Gallic Wars and Civil War, stand as masterpieces of propaganda disguised as objective reporting. Written in the third person with seeming detachment, they systematically justified his actions while magnifying his accomplishments. His prose style, praised even by critics like Cicero for its stripped-down elegant simplicity, set literary standards for generations. His intellectual life defied the stereotype of the unthinking soldier. Fluent in Greek as well as Latin, he composed works on grammar, astronomy, and rhetoric that have mostly been lost to history. His calendar reform demonstrated sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics, creating the Julian calendar that remained largely unchanged for over 1,500 years. His strategic innovations revealed a mind that constantly questioned conventional approaches, adapting Germanic tribal tactics, incorporating Gallic cavalry techniques, and revolutionizing siege warfare through engineering brilliance. Even during the most intense campaigns, he maintained correspondence with leading intellectuals of his age, discussing philosophy with Cicero despite their political enmity and engaging in theological debates about the nature of divine providence. His personal library, reportedly one of the largest in Rome, contained works on subjects ranging from military engineering to poetry, from natural philosophy to historical analysis. He memorized vast quantities of verse, often reciting Homer or Ennius to his officers during long marches, using classical examples to illustrate tactical principles or moral lessons. This intellectual curiosity extended to his treatment of conquered peoples, studying their customs, languages, and military practices not merely for strategic advantage, but from genuine scholarly interest. His ethnographic observations of Germanic and Celtic societies, embedded within his military narratives, provide invaluable historical records of cultures that left few written sources of their own. The complexity of his character emerges most clearly in his personal relationships, where calculation and genuine affection often intertwined in ways that even he may not have fully understood. His marriage to Calpurnia represented political alliance, yet ancient sources suggest real tenderness between them, particularly evident in his concern for her prophetic dreams, warning of his assassination. His relationship with Cleopatra combined romantic passion with strategic necessity, creating one of history's most famous love affairs while securing Egypt's wealth for Roman purposes. The man who showed extraordinary clemency to defeated enemies could also display ruthless pragmatism when circumstances demanded it, selling entire Gallic tribes into slavery while pardoning Roman citizens who had taken arms against him. This paradox perhaps reflects not hypocrisy but the complex demands of leadership in an age when personal relationships and political necessities were inextricably intertwined. The most fascinating aspect of Julius Caesar lies not in any single quality, but in the bewildering array of contradictions that defined his character. Here was a man who could compose elegant poetry, while directing the slaughter of hundreds of thousands, who displayed extraordinary clemency to defeated enemies yet sold entire populations into slavery without apparent moral conflict. These paradoxes reveal not inconsistency, but rather the complex adaptations required for survival and success in the brutal political landscape of late Republican Rome. Caesar's intellectual pursuits painted him as a refined scholar and patron of the arts. He wrote extensively, producing works on grammar, astronomy, and military strategy that contemporaries praised for their clarity and insight. His lost work, De Analogia, dedicated to Cicero, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of linguistic theory. He patronized poets like Catullus despite their satirical attacks on his character, and maintained correspondence with leading philosophers of his age. Yet this same cultured intellectual could order the massacre of Germanic tribes with clinical detachment, viewing human suffering through the cold lens of political necessity. His personal relationships revealed equally striking contradictions. Caesar married 3 times, first to Cornelia, daughter of the powerful consul Cinna, then to Pompeia, granddaughter of his enemy Sulla, and finally to Calpurnia, whose father provided useful political connections. His devotion to Cornelia appeared genuine, as he risked Sulla's wrath by refusing to divorce her when ordered. However, his subsequent marriages clearly served strategic purposes, cementing alliances and neutralizing potential opposition. His romantic entanglements extended far beyond marriage, creating a web of relationships that scandalized and fascinated Roman society. His affair with Servilia, mother of his future assassin Brutus, provided access to one of Rome's most influential families. His legendary relationship with Cleopatra combined genuine passion with calculated political advantage, securing Egypt's vast resources for his cause while producing a son who might have continued his dynasty. Even his rumored relationships with men, particularly King Nicomedes of Bithynia, served dual purposes of personal satisfaction and diplomatic necessity, though they provided endless ammunition for his political enemies. Caesar's famous clemency toward defeated opponents represented perhaps his most calculated contradiction. Roman tradition demanded vengeance against traitors and enemies, as demonstrated by the proscription lists of Marius and Sulla that had terrorized Caesar's own youth. Yet after his victory at Pharsalus, he conspicuously pardoned prominent enemies like Brutus, Cassius, and initially even Cicero. This mercy served multiple purposes beyond genuine magnanimity. It contrasted dramatically with the bloody reigns of previous strongmen, presenting Caesar as a more civilized alternative to civil war's usual brutality. More importantly, pardoned enemies became living advertisements for his benevolence, their very presence in Rome testifying to his superior character and restraint. However, this same man who spared Roman aristocrats thought nothing of enslaving entire Gallic populations or crucifying pirates who had dared to capture him in his youth. His financial behavior revealed additional contradictions that baffled contemporaries and modern historians alike. In his early career, Caesar accumulated debts so staggering that creditors reportedly feared his death more than his default, knowing they would never recover their investments from his estate. At one point, he owed approximately 25 million denarii, a sum that could have funded entire military campaigns. He spent lavishly on public games, private entertainments, and political bribes, treating money as merely a tool for advancement rather than wealth to be preserved. Yet after his Gallic conquests filled his personal treasury with unprecedented riches, he implemented careful financial reforms for the Republic, standardizing currency, regulating public expenditures, and demonstrating unexpected fiscal discipline in managing state resources. Perhaps most fundamentally contradictory was Caesar's relationship with Roman tradition itself. Born into the ancient patrician Julian family, which claimed descent from Venus herself, he received traditional education in ancestral customs and presented himself as defender of Roman dignity and honor. His early career followed conventional patterns of political advancement through the cursus honorum, and he held Rome's most sacred religious office as Pontifex Maximus. Yet his actions repeatedly shattered precedent and tradition. From crossing the Rubicon with armed legions to accepting divine honors in the East, he simultaneously exploited conservative reverence for tradition while systematically undermining traditional constraints on individual power. His religious attitudes exemplified this duality between public conformity and private skepticism. As Pontifex Maximus, he fulfilled Rome's highest religious duties with apparent piety, conducting sacrifices and interpreting omens according to ancient ritual. However, his private correspondence and recorded conversations revealed views more aligned with Epicurean philosophy than traditional Roman beliefs. When augurs reported unfavorable omens before important battles, he reportedly dismissed their concerns with characteristic pragmatism, declaring that omens would prove more favorable when he chose to make them so. This tension between public religious observance and private rational calculation characterized his approach to many aspects of Roman life. Modern attempts to reconcile these contradictions often miss their essential purpose within the context of late Republican politics. Caesar operated in an environment where survival required multiple personas and adaptability to rapidly changing circumstances. The same qualities that made him an effective military commander, capable of inspiring fierce loyalty among his troops, also made him a dangerous political opponent who could not be trusted to respect traditional limitations on power. His assassins justified their actions as necessary tyrannicide, while his supporters deified him as Rome's savior. And both groups found ample evidence in his complex character to support their opposing interpretations. Perhaps the truest assessment comes from understanding that Caesar embodied the contradictions of his age itself, an era when traditional republican values collided with the practical demands of governing a Mediterranean empire. The conspiracy that would forever alter the course of history began not in the shadows of Rome's slums, but in the marble halls where privilege and power intersected. In the early months of 44 BC, as Caesar finalized his ambitious plans for the Parthian expedition that would carry Roman eagles to India's borders, a different kind of campaign took shape among Rome's most distinguished citizens. The plotters were not desperate revolutionaries or downtrodden masses seeking justice, but senators, former enemies who had received clemency, and even personal friends of the man they planned to kill. This paradox would define everything about the conspiracy that followed. The men who gathered in whispered conversations throughout Rome's elite districts represented a cross-section of the very establishment that had seemingly accommodated itself to Caesar's rule. Gaius Cassius Longinus stood at the conspiracy's practical center, a man whose motivations revealed the complex blend of personal grievance and political principle that drove the plot forward. A skilled military commander who had saved Syria from Parthian invasion after Crassus's catastrophic defeat, Cassius combined proven competence with burning ambition that Caesar's new order seemed to frustrate at every turn. His decision to approach Marcus Brutus came after being passed over for the prestigious urban praetorship in favor of the younger man, despite Cassius's greater seniority and military achievements. According to Plutarch, when Caesar made this appointment, he privately admitted his reservations about Cassius, saying, "What does Cassius want? I do not like him much, for he is pale and lean." This dismissive assessment from the dictator himself may have been the final insult that transformed political opposition into deadly conspiracy. Cassius understood that successful tyrannicide required more than military competence or political grievance. It needed moral authority, the kind of legitimacy that only one man in Rome could provide. Marcus Junius Brutus emerged as the conspiracy's essential moral center, though not its original instigator. His participation carried symbolic weight that transcended his individual standing in Roman society. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, had overthrown Rome's last king nearly 5 centuries earlier, establishing the very republic that the conspirators claimed to defend. This heritage made the younger Brutus's recruitment both crucial and deeply ironic, given his complex personal relationship with the man he would help destroy. Servilia, Brutus's mother, had been Caesar's longtime lover, creating persistent rumors that Brutus might actually be the dictator's illegitimate son. While Plutarch dismisses this possibility based on chronological evidence, the psychological complexity of their relationship added layers of drama to the unfolding conspiracy. More concretely, Caesar had spared Brutus's life after Pharsalus, despite his fighting for Pompey, later appointing him governor of Cisalpine Gaul and praetor for 44 BC. This personal connection of debt and favor made Brutus's eventual betrayal all the more shocking to those who witnessed it. The recruitment of Brutus required careful psychological manipulation that revealed Cassius's understanding of Roman political theater. Anonymous messages began appearing at Brutus's tribunal, reading, "You are not a Brutus," and "If only Brutus were alive." Psychological prods likely planted by Cassius to exploit the younger man's sense of ancestral duty. These appeals to family honor and republican tradition gradually overcame Brutus's personal loyalty to the man who had shown him such extraordinary clemency. Once Brutus committed to the cause, recruitment accelerated rapidly among Rome's senatorial class. Prominent figures like Tullius Cimber, Decimus Brutus, and Gaius Trebonius joined the conspiracy, men who had fought for Caesar in the Civil War and now enjoyed positions in his administration. This paradox pervaded the entire conspiracy and revealed its fundamental contradiction. Those plotting to restore the Republic were largely beneficiaries of the regime they sought to overthrow. Of the approximately 60 conspirators who eventually joined the plot, virtually all had received pardons, appointments, or other advantages from the man they now planned to kill. The decision to assassinate rather than legally remove Caesar reflected the harsh political reality that the conspirators faced in early 44 BC. The Senate, packed with Caesar's appointees and supporters, would never vote to rescind his extraordinary powers or challenge his authority through constitutional means. The popular assemblies, direct beneficiaries of his land distributions and debt relief programs, remained firmly supportive of their benefactor. The urban masses, entertained by his spectacular games and fed by his grain distributions, showed no signs of turning against the dictator who had improved their daily lives. Only elimination offered the conspirators hope of restoring what they imagined to be the traditional republican system. Yet their planning revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the forces that had brought Caesar to power in the first place. They seemed to believe that removing one man could somehow reverse the structural changes that had transformed Rome from a city-state republic into a Mediterranean empire requiring centralized administration. Their discussions focused obsessively on the act of killing itself while giving little thought to what would follow Caesar's death. This narrow focus on tyrannicide rather than comprehensive political reform would prove fatal to their cause. The conspirators met in small groups throughout the early months of 44 BC, often in the homes of prominent senators or in the quiet corners of public buildings where their conversations could appear casual. They debated methods and timing with the intensity of military planners preparing for a crucial battle. Some argued for poisoning, others for ambush outside the city, but gradually consensus emerged around a public assassination that would demonstrate their courage and commitment to Republican values. The Senate House itself became their preferred venue, a location that would symbolically link their action to the restoration of senatorial authority that Caesar had so systematically undermined. What the conspirators failed to grasp was that Caesar had become both symptom and catalyst of changes far deeper than any individual's ambition. The Roman Republic's traditional institutions had proven inadequate to govern an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt, creating the very power vacuum that strongmen like Marius, Sulla, and Caesar had filled. Their belief that killing one man could restore a system that had already demonstrated its structural inadequacy revealed the profound disconnect between their nostalgic vision and political reality. They imagined themselves as liberators following in the footsteps of the first Brutus, but they were actually preparing to unleash forces that would destroy the very republic they claimed to save. The conspiracy that took shape in those early months of 44 BC represented the last desperate attempt of Rome's traditional governing class to turn back the tide of historical change through violence. Their planning proceeded with the methodical care of men convinced of their righteousness, yet blind to the consequences of their actions. As the Ides of March approached, 60 senators prepared to commit an act they believed would restore Roman liberty, unaware that they were about to ensure its final destruction. The morning of March 15, 44 BCE, dawned gray and foreboding over Rome, as if the very heavens sensed the momentous events about to unfold. In the grand theater complex built by his former rival Pompey, Julius Caesar would face his destiny in one of history's most famous assassinations. The conspiracy had reached its final stage, with 60 senators now committed to an act they believed would restore Roman liberty, but would instead plunge the Republic into its death throes. Caesar's morning began with increasingly ominous signs that even his rational mind struggled to dismiss. His wife Calpurnia, normally composed and dignified, had spent the night in the grip of terrifying nightmares. She dreamed of cradling Caesar's bloodied corpse, of their house collapsing around them, of omens so vivid and disturbing that she begged her husband with tears in her eyes to remain home. The dictator, though typically skeptical of superstition, found himself unsettled by her unusual distress. When the morning sacrifices were performed, the priests discovered something unprecedented and deeply troubling. The sacrificial animals, when cut open, were found to lack hearts entirely, an omen so extraordinary that it defied natural explanation. Even Caesar's rational worldview wavered in the face of such an unprecedented portent. For a brief moment, the man who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon considered yielding to his wife's pleas and the warnings of the gods. According to Suetonius, he actually began drafting a message to postpone the Senate meeting, more to ease Calpurnia's fears than from personal concern. This moment of hesitation proved crucial, for it brought the arrival of Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants, and, ironically, one of the key conspirators. Decimus had commanded Caesar's fleet during the Civil War and enjoyed the dictator's complete confidence. Now he would use that trust to ensure his patron's destruction. With the practiced ease of a longtime friend, Decimus mocked Caesar's apparent susceptibility to dreams and omens. He argued that postponement would insult the assembled senators and damage Caesar's reputation for decisive leadership. More persuasively, he reminded Caesar that the Senate was prepared to discuss granting him the title of king for territories outside Italy, a significant step toward the Eastern-style monarchy many believed he desired. The appeal to Caesar's ambition and his concern for his dignitas, that crucial Roman concept of personal honor and reputation, proved decisive. Against his better judgment and his wife's tearful entreaties, Caesar decided to attend the meeting, though he planned to make only a brief appearance. As Caesar's litter made its way through Rome's crowded streets toward Pompey's theater, the warnings continued to accumulate. The soothsayer Spurinna, who had previously warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March, appeared along the road. Caesar, attempting to display confidence, called out that the Ides of March had come and nothing had happened. The prophet's reply would become legendary. "Aye, they have come, but they have not yet gone." A teacher of rhetoric named Artemidorus had learned of the conspiracy and prepared a detailed warning scroll. He positioned himself along Caesar's road, hoping to place the document directly in the dictator's hands. When Caesar's entourage arrived, Artemidorus pressed forward, desperately trying to deliver his message. But the crowd of petitioners was too thick, and Caesar's attendants, following normal protocol, collected the scroll with dozens of others to be read later. The warning that might have saved Caesar's life remained unread in the bundle of routine correspondence. Another senator, Popilius Laena, approached Caesar near the theater entrance with words that seemed to acknowledge the conspiracy. He wished Caesar good fortune in his enterprise that day, speaking in a tone that suggested hidden knowledge. Caesar's companions noticed the odd exchange, but the dictator himself appeared not to grasp its significance. The accumulation of warnings, omens, and strange encounters would later be seen as clear evidence that the gods themselves had tried to prevent the tragedy. But Caesar, driven by a lifetime of taking calculated risks and perhaps by a fatalistic acceptance of his destiny, pressed forward into the theater complex. The choice of venue carried profound symbolic weight that was not lost on the conspirators. Pompey's theater complex, the first permanent stone theater in Rome, represented the pinnacle of Republican achievement and civic pride. Here, in the shadow of a statue of the man Caesar had defeated and driven to his death, the dictator would meet his own end. The theater's attached Senate House, where the meeting was to be held, provided the conspirators with the perfect setting for their act. Unlike the traditional curia, this space allowed senators to move freely, without the rigid seating arrangements that might have hindered their approach. The conspirators had positioned themselves strategically throughout the chamber, some near the entrance, others closer to Caesar's chair. Julius Caesar, whose petition for his exiled brother would serve as the pretext for the attack, had rehearsed his approach countless times. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Caesar would present his petition, drawing Caesar's attention, while other conspirators gathered around in apparent support. At the crucial moment, Caesar would grasp Caesar's toga, the signal for the attack to begin. Each conspirator knew his role. Each had steeled himself for the moment when Roman senators would become assassins in the name of liberty. As Caesar entered the chamber, flanked by his lictors and preceded by the formal ceremonies of Roman governance, none present could predict that they were witnessing the final act of the Roman Republic. The conspirators, convinced they were about to restore Roman freedom, were actually preparing to destroy it forever. Caesar, despite all the warnings and omens, walked confidently toward his chair, unaware that within minutes he would be bleeding to death at the base of Pompey's statue. The die, as he had once said at another river crossing, was cast. The morning of March 15, 44 BCE, dawned with an atmosphere thick with foreboding in Rome. As Caesar prepared to leave his house for what would be his final Senate meeting, the city itself seemed to whisper warnings that only he failed to hear. Spurenna, the soothsayer who had earlier warned him about the Ides of March, stood along the route to the theater of Pompey. According to Plutarch, when the dictator spotted the prophet, he remarked with mild sarcasm, "The Ides of March have come," to which Spurenna ominously replied, "They have come, but they have not yet passed." The warning hung in the air like incense from a funeral pyre, but Caesar dismissed it with the confidence of a man who had faced death countless times on battlefields across Gaul and emerged victorious. A final, more concrete warning came from a supporter named Artemidorus, a Greek teacher of rhetoric who had somehow learned details of the conspiracy. This brave man thrust a written message detailing the plot directly into Caesar's hands as he approached the Senate House. But Caesar, preoccupied with greeting citizens and receiving the endless stream of petitions that followed him everywhere, simply added the unread document to the papers he carried, intending to review them during the Senate meeting. That scroll, containing the names of his would-be assassins and their plans, remained unopened in his hands even as he walked toward his death. The irony was profound: salvation literally within his grasp, ignored in favor of the routine business of ruling an empire. Around 60 conspirators had positioned themselves throughout the theater of Pompey complex, the grand structure built by his former ally and rival. This location had been chosen not just for its convenience as a Senate meeting place, but for its symbolic power. Caesar would die surrounded by monuments to Pompey's glory. Some conspirators mingled casually among the other senators in the main meeting chamber, their faces masks of normalcy despite the daggers hidden beneath their togas. Others stationed themselves at strategic points throughout the complex to prevent interference from Caesar's supporters or to secure escape routes should the plan go awry. Every man among them carried concealed weapons, daggers forbidden in the Senate, but easily hidden beneath the folds of their traditional garments or tucked into document cases. The plan they had rehearsed required careful coordination and split-second timing. Julius Caesar would approach Caesar with a petition regarding his exiled brother, a request designed to seem routine and unthreatening. At the crucial moment, Caesar would grab the dictator's toga and pull it down from his shoulders, both restraining him and serving as the signal for the attack to begin. Publius Servilius Casca would strike the first blow, followed immediately by coordinated attacks from all conspirators to prevent any possibility of escape or effective resistance. They had planned for every contingency except their own success. What would happen after Caesar lay dead had been left remarkably vague. The dictator arrived at the theater of Pompey in a litter rather than walking, a detail that sent ripples of concern through the waiting conspirators. This suggested possible illness that might lead to a postponement of the Senate meeting, which could unravel their carefully timed plot. Their anxiety heightened when Caesar paused before entering the building, conducting further sacrifices to read the omens, whose results clearly troubled the attending priests. The soothsayers examined the entrails of the sacrificial animals and found them lacking a heart, an omen so dire that they urged Caesar to cancel all public business for the day. But Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators who had gained Caesar's trust through years of loyal service, intervened with smooth words about the Senate's expectations and the embarrassment of cancellation. Mark Antony, whose physical strength, military experience, and unwavering loyalty made him perhaps the greatest single threat to their plot, briefly engaged Caesar in conversation outside the building. This unexpected delay raised fears among the conspirators that Antony might have been warned of the plot or might simply accompany Caesar into the chamber. But Gaius Trebonius, another conspirator, smoothly approached Antony and drew him aside with manufactured conversation about urgent matters requiring his attention. As Caesar moved toward his golden chair positioned directly before Pompey's statue, the entire Senate rose in traditional respect for his office. No unusual tension showed on the conspirators' faces as they watched their target settle into his seat. These were men experienced in war and politics, skilled at concealing their true intentions behind masks of civility and respect. The session opened with routine matters, petitions and administrative business that provided perfect cover for what was to come. Then Tullius Cimber approached with his carefully prepared petition regarding his exiled brother, a request that seemed entirely normal and reasonable. Other conspirators gradually moved closer, ostensibly to support Cimber's petition, creating a small crowd around the seated dictator that effectively blocked him from the view of non-conspirators. When Caesar dismissed the petition, with a gesture suggesting it would be addressed later through proper channels, Cimber suddenly grabbed the purple, bordered toga with both hands. He pulled it down from Caesar's shoulders with surprising force, both restraining the dictator's arms and sending the prearranged signal to attack. "Why, this is violence," Caesar exclaimed as Publius Servilius Casca struck the first blow. But the dagger, poorly aimed due to Casca's nervousness in the crucial moment, only grazed Caesar's neck and shoulder. The dictator, his survival instincts honed by decades of warfare, immediately seized Casca's arm and shouted in Latin, "Casca, what are you doing?" He stabbed at his assailant with his stylus, the metal writing implement being his only available weapon in a chamber where arms were forbidden. This brief resistance ended quickly as the other conspirators swarmed around him from all sides. Daggers thrust toward his face, his chest, his limbs in a frenzied attack that had more in common with a mob killing than the dignified execution they had envisioned. According to the historian Eutropius, Caesar initially fought back with desperate strength until his eyes found Marcus Brutus among his attackers. At the sight of his protégé, the young man he had favored and possibly his own son, joining the assault, Caesar reportedly uttered in Greek, "Kai su, teknon, you too, my child." These words, later immortalized by Shakespeare as, "It too, brute," marked the moment when Caesar's resistance crumbled. Whether giving up in resignation at this ultimate betrayal or simply overwhelmed by the number of attackers, he drew his toga over his face and ceased to fight. 23 dagger wounds were later counted on his body by the physician Antistius, though only one proved fatal, a thrust between the ribs that penetrated his heart. Caesar collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, the marble splattered with his blood in a final irony that would have satisfied the gods of tragedy. The conspirators, in their frenzied determination to ensure that each man shared responsibility for the deed, collided with one another and accidentally wounded several of their own number. The great Caesar, conqueror of Gaul and master of the Roman world, died not in glorious battle but bleeding out on a Senate floor, killed by men he had called friends. The assassination lasted only minutes, but its consequences would reshape the ancient world for centuries to come. The conspirators' naive belief that the Roman Republic would naturally reclaim its traditional function once its subverter was removed proved instantly and catastrophically wrong. Outside the Senate House, news of the assassination spread rapidly through a city already tense with rumors and whispered fears. The conspirators marched to the Capitoline Hill with their bloody daggers still dripping, proclaiming the restoration of liberty to anyone who would listen, but they found an unexpectedly muted and even hostile public response. Common citizens who had benefited most from Caesar's generous reforms, his grain distributions, his public works projects, and his debt relief programs, displayed confusion or outright hostility rather than the anticipated gratitude for their supposed liberation. Veterans of Caesar's campaigns, thousands of whom lived in the city while awaiting settlement in the promised colonies that would secure their retirement, presented a particular and immediate danger to the assassins who claimed to have liberated Rome from tyranny. By nightfall of that fateful March 15th, the conspirators had barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill, protected by gladiators hired by Decimus Brutus, while the city below simmered with dangerous uncertainty and barely contained rage. Their bold strike had eliminated the dictator, but it had left his entire power structure, his loyalists, his beneficiaries, and his political machinery largely intact and increasingly hostile. Mark Antony, initially fearing inclusion in the assassination plot and fleeing in terror, quickly recovered his composure once he realized the conspirators had targeted only Caesar himself. With characteristic opportunism and political cunning, Antony moved swiftly to secure Caesar's house and papers, gaining control of both his official correspondence and his substantial personal treasury. As darkness fell over a Rome torn between celebration and mourning, the body of history's most famous assassination victim remained temporarily forgotten on the Senate floor where he had fallen. The man who had conquered all of Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and reformed Rome's very calendar lay alone in the gathering shadows, abandoned by friend and foe alike. Eventually, 3 loyal household slaves discovered their master's corpse, placed it carefully on a litter, and carried it home through the darkened streets, one arm hanging limply from beneath the covering cloth. The republic that the conspirators claimed to have liberated had received a wound far deeper and more dangerous than the 23 stab wounds inflicted on its most controversial citizen. The coming days would reveal whether that constitutional wound might somehow heal through compromise and reconciliation, or if it would fester into renewed civil war more destructive than any single man's ambition had ever been. The conspirators who retreated to the Capitoline Hill on the evening of the Ides of March had achieved their immediate tactical goal of eliminating Caesar. But they had utterly failed to secure their broader revolution. Having removed the dictator through violence, they discovered that killing a man proved far easier than killing the dangerous idea he had come to represent in the minds of Rome's citizens. As dawn broke on March 16th, they faced a city not celebrating its liberation from tyranny, but simmering with dangerous uncertainty and growing resentment toward those who had destroyed their benefactor. Mark Antony, the surviving consul and Caesar's most loyal lieutenant, moved with decisive opportunism during the crucial hours immediately following the assassination. After ensuring his own safety and confirming that the conspiracy had targeted only Caesar, he secured the dictator's residence with military precision, taking possession of his private papers and an enormous personal treasury containing approximately 100 million sestertii. This single calculated act provided Antony with both the financial resources necessary for a potential power struggle and crucial insight into Caesar's plans, connections, and political network. He also gained custody of Caesar's will, a document whose contents would dramatically alter the entire political landscape in ways the conspirators never anticipated. The day after the assassination witnessed frantic political maneuvering from all factions, as each side sought to consolidate their position and assess their strength. Brutus addressed the populace from the Capitoline Hill, delivering a carefully reasoned speech justifying the assassination as necessary to preserve traditional Roman liberty and constitutional government. His oratory, while eloquent and philosophically sophisticated, resonated primarily with those already sympathetic to the Republican cause, the old aristocratic families and conservative elements who had long chafed under Caesar's increasingly monarchical dominance. The common citizens who had benefited most from Caesar's reforms, his generous largesse, and his promise of a better future, received these abstract appeals to traditional liberty with notable coolness and growing suspicion. Cicero, the great orator who had maintained a carefully ambiguous position during Caesar's rise to power, now emerged as a potential mediator, proposing a general amnesty that would grant forgiveness to the assassins while simultaneously ratifying all of Caesar's acts and appointments. This delicate compromise aimed to prevent immediate civil conflict while preserving the existing constitutional structure and preventing the complete collapse of governmental authority. In a Senate hastily assembled in the Temple of Tellus, safely distant from both the assassination site and potential public disturbances, this proposal gained majority support from senators desperate to avoid immediate chaos. However, the apparent truce masked much deeper calculations and mutual distrust on both sides. For the conspirators, amnesty provided crucial breathing room to consolidate their position and build broader support for their cause. For Antony and other Caesarians, maintaining Caesar's acts preserved their offices, their power, and their political networks while they carefully assessed their true strength and options. Neither side viewed this arrangement as permanent, merely as necessary preparation for the coming power struggle that would determine Rome's ultimate fate. The critical turning point came with the public reading of Caesar's will, a moment that would transform the entire political dynamic. Antony, recognizing the document's explosive potential for reshaping public opinion, carefully arranged for this reading to follow Caesar's funeral, weaponizing grief and emotion before revealing the final evidence of the dictator's genuine care for the Roman people. The critical turning point came with the public reading of Caesar's will, a moment that would transform the entire political dynamic. Antony, recognizing the document's explosive potential for reshaping public opinion, carefully arranged for this reading to follow Caesar's funeral, weaponizing grief and emotion before revealing the final evidence of the dictator's genuine care for the Roman people. The will itself contained provisions so generous they bordered on the revolutionary, demonstrating that even in death, Caesar understood how to capture the hearts of ordinary Romans. The document's most stunning revelation was Caesar's adoption of his 18-year-old grand-nephew, Gaius Octavius, transforming an obscure student studying in Apollonia into Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, heir to 3/4 of the dictator's vast fortune and, more importantly, bearer of the most powerful name in Roman politics. This young man, previously known only as a quiet member of Caesar's extended family, suddenly found himself thrust into the center of Roman power struggles as the adopted son of the martyred leader. The will's second provision struck directly at the conspirators' claims of liberation, revealing Caesar's posthumous gift of 300 sestertii to every Roman citizen, a sum representing several months' wages for ordinary workers. Beyond this monetary bequest, the dictator dedicated his magnificent gardens across the Tiber River for permanent public use, creating recreational spaces that would serve generations of Romans. These provisions painted a vivid contrast between Caesar's generosity and the aristocratic conspirators who claimed to champion the people while offering them nothing but abstract concepts of liberty. The timing of these revelations proved devastating to the assassins' cause, coming just as public opinion wavered between uncertainty and anger. Antony's orchestration of Caesar's funeral transformed what could have been a solemn ceremony into a masterpiece of political theater that would echo through history. The dictator's body, displayed on an ivory couch in the Forum, bore visible evidence of the 23 wounds inflicted by his assassins, creating a powerful visual reminder of the violence that had shattered Rome's peace. Antony's funeral oration, which Shakespeare would later immortalize in dramatic verse, demonstrated the consul's sophisticated understanding of crowd psychology and political manipulation. Rather than directly attacking the conspirators, still protected by the Senate's amnesty, Antony simply recounted Caesar's achievements, read aloud the honors bestowed upon him by the Roman people, and finally displayed the dictator's blood-stained toga to the assembled thousands. This calculated restraint proved far more effective than direct condemnation, allowing the crowd to draw their own conclusions while building emotional pressure that would soon explode into violence. The sight of Caesar's torn and bloody garments triggered an immediate transformation in the crowd's mood, turning grief into rage and uncertainty into vengeful determination. The emotional impact of Antony's presentation overwhelmed the restraint that had characterized the initial public response to Caesar's assassination. Ordinary citizens, Many of them veterans who had served under Caesar in Gaul or beneficiaries of his land distributions and social programs abandoned all pretense of calm acceptance. A spontaneous cremation began in the forum itself, with mourners throwing wooden objects, clothing, jewelry, and anything combustible onto a growing pyre that threatened to spread fire to nearby buildings. This impromptu funeral transformed into the first violent expression of public backlash against the assassins, as grief-stricken citizens sought immediate outlets for their rage. Mobs formed throughout the city seeking vengeance against anyone connected to the conspiracy, particularly targeting those unfortunate enough to share names with the assassins. Cinna the poet, mistaken for Cinna the praetor, who had participated in the assassination, was torn to pieces by an enraged crowd despite his protests of innocence and his actual support for Caesar. This brutal murder demonstrated how completely public sentiment had shifted against the conspirators and their cause. The conspirators, recognizing the dangerous transformation in Rome's political climate, accelerated their departure from the city they claimed to have liberated. Within days of the funeral, most had fled to their assigned provinces, abandoning the capital and effectively conceding the immediate political battle to Caesar's supporters. Brutus and Cassius, the conspiracy's most prominent leaders, withdrew to their estates outside Rome while desperately negotiating for provincial assignments that would provide them with military resources and distance from the hostile urban population. The compromise that eventually emerged, granting Syria to Cassius and Macedonia to Brutus, reflected both their weakened position and the Senate's urgent desire to disperse potential flashpoints for renewed conflict. The conspirators who struck down Caesar on the Ides of March believed they were performing surgery on the Roman state, cutting out a cancerous growth that threatened to destroy the Republic forever. What they failed to fully anticipate was that the Republic they had hoped to restore through a single act of violence was instead fragmenting into competing power bases that would tear Rome apart more thoroughly than any dictator ever could. The vacuum created by removing the central figure who had held these forces in balance would soon draw all parties into a new and even more destructive civil war that would rage for over a decade. The dictator whose living ambition the conspirators had feared proved more dangerous in death than in life, his ghost haunting every political calculation and military campaign that followed. His assassination, intended as the decisive act that would resolve Rome's political crisis, instead removed the only figure with sufficient authority to manage the Republic's contradictions and competing interests. What followed would demonstrate that the conspirators had killed a man, but not the forces of history that had produced him, forces that would soon elevate his young heir beyond even his adoptive father's unprecedented power. The assassination designed to restore the Republic instead ignited 13 years of civil conflict, more devastating than the struggle it sought to end, revealing the fundamental impossibility of returning to the old ways. What the conspirators failed to understand was that the dictator had not created Rome's structural problems, but merely exploited them with exceptional skill and ruthlessness. His removal did nothing to address the underlying fault lines that had been growing for generations, the gulf between rich and poor that had widened into an unbridgeable chasm, the divergent interests of Italy and the provinces that pulled the state in different directions. The professional army's loyalty to generals rather than the state remained unchanged, creating multiple centers of military power that answered to no central authority. Most critically, the inadequacy of republican institutions for governing a vast empire became more apparent than ever as senators struggled to manage territories spanning 3 continents with a system designed for a city-state. The very wealth that flowed from these conquests had corrupted the traditional Roman virtues that once held the Republic together, replacing civic duty with personal ambition and transforming public service into private profit. Without Caesar's dominating presence to impose order through fear and charisma, these contradictions exploded into open warfare as every faction pursued its own vision of Rome's future. The conflict following the Ides of March unfolded in distinct phases, each reshaping Rome's political landscape as personalities and principles collided in kaleidoscopic recombination that defied all traditional expectations. Young Octavian, not yet 20 years old, demonstrated political instincts that belied his youth and shocked even seasoned observers who had dismissed him as merely another wealthy young man trading on a famous name. Arriving in Italy with modest resources but powerful symbolic capital as the dictator's heir, he methodically built his position through calculated risk, taking that combined audacity with careful planning. When Antony rejected his claims to his inheritance and attempted to block his adoption, Octavian audaciously sold his own properties and borrowed heavily to fulfill his adoptive father's bequests to the people and soldiers. This gesture established him as the true heir in popular perception, while making veterans personally indebted to him, creating a bond of obligation that would prove more valuable than gold. More surprisingly, he cultivated the Senate, particularly Cicero, who saw the youth as a useful counterweight to Antony's growing power and dangerous ambitions. This alliance between the dictator's heir and Republican senators demonstrated how principle increasingly gave way to pragmatism in the fluid post-assassination environment where survival mattered more than ideology. Cicero famously remarked that the young Caesar should be praised, honored, and eliminated, underestimating both Octavian's cunning and his patience in pursuing long-term goals. Antony, initially advantaged by his consulship and close relationship with the dictator, overplayed his hand through arrogance and miscalculation that revealed his fundamental lack of political subtlety. His attempt to take control of Cisalpine Gaul, currently governed by Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators, prompted the Senate to declare him a public enemy and authorize military action against him. In the brief conflict that followed, known as the Mutina Campaign, Antony faced a remarkable coalition that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The assassin Decimus Brutus defended his province with desperate determination, knowing that surrender meant certain death and that his cause represented the last hope for republican restoration. The dictator's heir, Octavian, commanded an army partially composed of his adoptive father's veterans who followed him out of loyalty to Caesar's memory rather than any love for the Republic. The Senate supported both against the man they now viewed as the primary threat to Republican restoration, creating the surreal situation of Caesar's assassin and Caesar's heir fighting side by side. This alignment proved temporary and fragile, held together only by shared opposition to Antony rather than any common vision for Rome's future. After Antony's defeat and retreat toward Transalpine Gaul, the Senate attempted to marginalize Octavian, having used him against the more immediate threat and now viewing him as expendable. The young heir responded by marching on Rome with 8 legions in August 43 BC, forcing his election as consul and officially outlawing the assassins who had killed his adoptive father. This naked use of military power against constitutional authority demonstrated how thoroughly the republican system had collapsed when a teenager with no previous office could compel Rome's highest position through armed threat. The prescriptions that followed would make even Sulla's reign of terror look restrained by comparison, as the new regime systematically eliminated its enemies and seized their wealth to fund the coming war. The Second Triumvirate's first act would eclipse even Sulla's notorious purges in its systematic brutality and scope. Hundreds of senators and thousands of equites found their names inscribed on death lists posted throughout Rome, their property confiscated, and their lives forfeit to the new regime's insatiable need for funds and revenge. The proscriptions operated with chilling efficiency, as bounty hunters and soldiers scoured Italy for victims whose only crime was possessing wealth or having opposed the triumvirs. Most infamous among the condemned was Marcus Tullius Cicero, whose inclusion Antony demanded in revenge for the orator's devastating philippics that had branded him an enemy of the state. The great voice of Latin eloquence, who had spent his life defending republican institutions through words rather than swords, was murdered on December 7, 43 BC, as he attempted to flee to Macedonia. His head and hands were severed and displayed in the Forum, where he had delivered his greatest speeches, a grotesque trophy that symbolized the death of reasoned discourse in Roman politics. Antony's wife Fulvia reportedly pierced Cicero's tongue with her hairpin, a final act of vindictive cruelty against the man who had dared oppose her husband's ambitions. With Italy secured through terror and systematic confiscation, the triumvirs turned their attention eastward to confront Caesar's assassins, who had used their 2 years of preparation effectively. Brutus and Cassius had raised 20 legions and substantial naval forces from the eastern provinces and client kingdoms, creating a formidable military force that represented the Republic's final stand. The decisive confrontation came at Philippi in northern Greece in October 42 BC, where Republican forces faced the combined armies of Antony and Octavian in a battle that would determine Rome's future. The terrain favored neither side particularly, with the Republican forces holding strong defensive positions but lacking the unified command structure that characterized their opponents. The battle unfolded in two separate engagements separated by weeks of maneuvering and skirmishing that tested both sides' resolve and resources. In the first engagement, Cassius's forces faced defeat against Antony's superior generalship and the disciplined advance of veteran legions hardened by years of civil conflict. Believing the entire battle lost when only his wing had collapsed, Cassius committed suicide rather than face capture, a critical blow to the Republican cause that deprived it of one of its most experienced commanders. His death created confusion and demoralization among the Republican ranks, as soldiers questioned whether their cause could survive without one of its principal leaders. In the second engagement 20 days later, Brutus initially held the advantage and seemed poised to reverse the earlier defeat through tactical superiority and the motivation of his troops. However, his forces lost cohesion as discipline broke down and soldiers abandoned their positions to plunder the enemy camp, a fatal error that exposed their flanks to counterattack. Surrounded and facing inevitable defeat as Antony's veterans exploited the breakdown in Republican lines, Brutus fell on his sword, reportedly declaring that virtue was merely a word. With the deaths of Brutus and Cassius, the Republican cause lost its standard-bearers and moral center, though resistance would continue under various leaders, including Sextus Pompey, son of Pompey the Great, who controlled Sicily and threatened Rome's grain supply. The principle of restoring traditional Republican governance effectively died at Philippi, buried beneath the corpses of the last men who believed in constitutional government over personal rule. The question was no longer whether Rome would be ruled by strongmen, but which strongmen would ultimately prevail in the struggle for supreme power. The triumvirate itself contained the seeds of its own destruction, as three ambitious men could never permanently share control of the Roman world without eventually turning against each other. Following Philippi, the triumvirs divided the Roman world according to their perceived strengths and ambitions, with Antony taking the wealthy eastern provinces, Octavian the more turbulent western territories, and Lepidus the African provinces. This division reflected their relative positions at the time, with Antony as senior partner commanding greater military experience and prestige, while Octavian remained the untested youth whose illness had kept him from significant command during the decisive battle. The following years saw a gradual but decisive reversal of fortune between the two principal triumvirs, as each faced distinct challenges that would test their political and military capabilities. Octavian confronted the difficult task of settling tens of thousands of veterans on Italian lands, displacing existing owners and creating widespread resentment that threatened his control of the peninsula. He also faced military challenges from Sextus Pompey's naval forces and Antony's ambitious wife Fulvia, who aligned with Octavian's discontented brother-in-law Lucius Antonius to initiate the brief but significant Perusine War. Octavian met these challenges with a combination of ruthlessness and strategic restraint that demonstrated his growing political maturity and understanding of power's requirements. After defeating Lucius Antonius, he executed the local councilors of Perugia, but spared his higher-born opponents, demonstrating both determination to crush resistance and calculated clemency toward those who might prove useful allies. Most importantly, he began a comprehensive program to refashion his public image from the terroristic triumvir responsible for proscriptions to the responsible restorer of Italian stability and traditional values. Meanwhile, Antony's position deteriorated despite his control of the East's vast resources and the loyalty of experienced legions that had served under Caesar in Gaul. His Parthian campaign, intended to emulate the dictator's planned expedition and secure the military glory necessary for supreme power, ended in near disaster and the loss of substantial forces. More damaging to his long-term prospects was his increasingly public relationship with Cleopatra. whose previous liaison with Caesar now evolved into an official alliance that would provide Octavian with perfect propaganda material. The final confrontation approached as the triumvirate officially expired, and two men prepared to contest for mastery of the Roman world. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC marked the final collapse of the Roman Republic, though few recognized it at the time. Cleopatra's magnificent war galleys, adorned with purple sails and golden ornaments, had fled the engagement when victory seemed uncertain, taking with them Antony's hopes and much of his fleet. The battle itself proved less decisive than its aftermath, as Antony and Cleopatra escaped to Egypt, but found their support evaporating like morning mist. When Octavian's disciplined legions reached Alexandria in the sweltering summer of 30 BC, both lovers chose suicide rather than the humiliation of captivity. Antony fell on his sword in the time-honored Roman tradition, while Cleopatra allegedly used a poisonous asp, befitting an Egyptian pharaoh's dramatic final gesture. With their deaths, the last significant opposition to Octavian's domination collapsed like a house built on sand. The 13-year civil war that had begun with the assassination of the dictator concluded with his adoptive son, holding power more absolute than Caesar himself had ever achieved. The Republic, which the conspirators had killed him to preserve, lay in irretrievable ruin, destroyed not by a single man's ambition, but by structural contradictions that made traditional governance impossible for a Mediterranean-wide empire. Octavian, soon to be renamed Augustus and granted unprecedented powers under the careful fiction of a restored republic, would create the imperial system that would govern the Roman world for 5 centuries. The Principate, as this system became known, maintained republican institutions as an elaborate facade while vesting real authority in a single ruler. This was precisely the arrangement the assassins had feared Caesar intended to establish. Through bloodshed, proscription, and political manipulation more thoroughgoing than anything his adoptive father had attempted, the youth once dismissed as merely the boy completed the transformation Caesar had begun. Augustus proved far more cunning than his famous father, wrapping absolute power in the comfortable clothing of republican tradition. He held no single office that granted supreme authority, instead accumulating various powers and titles that together made him master of Rome. The historical irony remains stark and bitter. The conspirators who killed Caesar to prevent monarchy instead created the precise conditions that made monarchy inevitable. In cutting down the man they feared would be king, they ensured the elevation of his son as emperor in all but name. The Republic did not survive its attempted restoration, serving as a testament to how profoundly Rome had already transformed before the daggers struck on the Ides of March. The city that had once been governed by citizen farmers meeting in the Forum had become the capital of a vast empire requiring professional administration. The old system of annual magistrates rotating through offices designed for a city-state could not effectively govern territories stretching from Britain to Egypt. Caesar had recognized this fundamental problem and begun addressing it through his reforms, but his assassination interrupted the process. The civil wars that followed demonstrated conclusively that the traditional republic was dead, killed not by Caesar's ambition, but by Rome's own success. Augustus completed what Caesar had started, creating a system that could actually govern the empire Rome had conquered. The man who died at the foot of Pompey's statue achieved in death what even his soaring ambition had not envisioned in life: true immortality in human memory. Few historical figures have left such an indelible mark on Western civilization, penetrating language, law, literature, and political thought across millennia. Caesar's deification began formally in 42 BC when the Senate, under triumviral pressure, officially declared him Divus Julius, the divine Julius. A magnificent temple rose in the Forum at the site of his cremation, where Romans offered sacrifices beneath the comet that had appeared during his funeral games, interpreted as his soul ascending to join the gods. This official cult, maintained throughout the imperial period, represented only the beginning of his posthumous elevation to legendary status. Augustus brilliantly exploited and carefully cultivated his connection to his deified father, using the title Divi Filius, son of the divine, prominently on coins and monuments. This religious sanction lent legitimacy to what was essentially military rule disguised as constitutional government. The Julian reforms in provincial administration, military organization, and citizenship expansion formed the foundation of imperial governance that would sustain Roman power for centuries. Even more enduring than political structures were the linguistic legacies that survive today. The seventh month became Julius, then July, in his honor, a designation that remains in use globally 2,000 years later. The title Caesar evolved from family name to imperial designation, then to the general concept of supreme ruler, as Kaiser in German and Tsar in Russian. It continued to denote sovereign authority well into the 20th century, with the last Kaiser abdicating only in 1918. Few individuals in history have achieved the linguistic immortality of having their name become a common noun in multiple languages. Caesar's administrative innovations showed similar remarkable longevity across the centuries. The Julian calendar, with its ingenious leap year system, governed Western timekeeping for 16 centuries until Pope Gregory VI's minor refinements created the Gregorian calendar still used today. His standardization of coinage established fiscal patterns that outlasted the empire itself, influencing monetary systems throughout Europe. His comprehensive census provided the model for population accounting used by governments into the modern era. Roman literature preserved his memory through complex, often contradictory portraits that reflected the ambiguity of his legacy. Virgil's Aeneid connected the Julian line directly to Rome's mythical founders, cementing claims of divine ancestry that Augustus would exploit masterfully. Lucan's Pharsalia presented a more ambiguous figure, brilliant but destructive, a man whose talents exceeded his wisdom, and whose ambitions ultimately consumed the state he claimed to serve. The true measure of Caesar's impact lies not in the monuments that crumbled or the empire that eventually fell, but in his transformation into something far more enduring than any mortal ruler could hope to achieve. He became an idea, a symbol, a mirror in which each successive civilization has seen reflected its own deepest concerns about power, ambition, and the delicate balance between effective leadership and democratic freedom. The literary tradition that emerged in the centuries following his death reveals this remarkable metamorphosis from historical figure to eternal archetype. Virgil's Aeneid, commissioned by Augustus himself, wove Caesar into the very fabric of Roman mythology, connecting the Julian line directly to Aeneas and the gods themselves. This wasn't merely political propaganda, but a conscious effort to transform a controversial dictator into a figure of destiny, someone whose rise had been ordained by the forces that shaped Rome's glorious future. Lucan's Pharsalia offered a darker vision, presenting Caesar as a figure of terrible brilliance whose crossing of the Rubicon marked not just the beginning of civil war, but the death of Roman liberty itself. In Lucan's epic, Caesar becomes almost supernatural in his destructive power, a force of nature that sweeps away the old world to make room for something entirely new and not necessarily better. Suetonius and Plutarch, writing with the benefit of historical distance, captured the intimate details that humanized this legendary figure for later generations. Through their careful documentation, we glimpse the man behind the monument, his famous last words, his struggles with epileptic seizures, his vanity about his baldness, and his complex relationships with friends and enemies alike. These biographical portraits preserved not just the public Caesar, but the private individual whose human frailties and strengths made his extraordinary achievements all the more remarkable. The Renaissance rediscovered these classical portraits with renewed fascination, finding in Caesar a perfect symbol for exploring the great questions of their own age about political legitimacy, individual greatness, and the eternal tension between republican ideals and effective governance. Dante placed Brutus and Cassius in the lowest circle of hell alongside Judas Iscariot, condemning them as the ultimate betrayers of their benefactor and friend. This moral judgment reflected medieval concepts of loyalty and divine authority that saw Caesar's assassination as a cosmic crime against the natural order. Machiavelli cited Caesar's fall as evidence that princes must be feared rather than loved, using his death to illustrate the practical realities of political survival in a world where idealism often proves fatal to those who practice it. These diverse interpretations reflected each era's particular preoccupations more than historical reality. Yet they kept Caesar's memory vibrant and relevant in European consciousness across the centuries. No treatment proved more influential than Shakespeare's dramatic portrayal, which transformed historical figures into timeless archetypes that continue to shape how we understand power and its consequences. His Julius Caesar gave us the ambitious ruler, the conflicted idealist Brutus, the manipulative Cassius, and the opportunistic Mark Antony, each representing different aspects of political psychology that transcend their Roman setting. Though historically inaccurate in many details, Shakespeare's rendering captured essential truths about power, rhetoric, and human nature that have resonated across centuries of political upheaval and social change. Lines like, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves," entered the cultural lexicon so completely that even those who never studied Roman history absorbed some essence of Caesar's story and its moral implications. Modern interpretations have continued this pattern of reinvention to serve contemporary concerns about leadership, democracy, and the proper limits of executive power. 19th century historians like Theodore Mommsen portrayed Caesar as a democratic reformer battling aristocratic privilege, a view that aligned perfectly with the liberal nationalist movements sweeping across Europe. 20th century dictators explicitly invoked Caesar's memory, with Mussolini's fascist ideology presenting itself as a revival of Roman imperial glory and Hitler drawing parallels between his own rise and Caesar's transformation of the Roman state. Post-war scholarship has increasingly emphasized Caesar's role in systematically undermining republican institutions while maintaining their outward forms, offering a cautionary tale for modern democracies facing similar challenges. Film and television have created their own versions of Caesar, from the dignified figure in Joseph L. Mankiewicz's 1953 adaptation of Shakespeare's play to the more complex and morally ambiguous portrayals in HBO's Rome series. Each generation discovers Caesar anew, finding aspects of his story that resonate with contemporary concerns about the concentration of power, the role of military force in politics, and the fragility of democratic institutions. His conquest of Gaul, celebrated in his lifetime as his greatest achievement, left an equally complex legacy that continues to shape our world today. While bringing devastating destruction to indigenous populations and cultures that had flourished for centuries, it also integrated what would become France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland into Mediterranean civilization. This process created the foundation for modern European culture, establishing trade networks, legal systems, and urban centers that would endure long after the Roman Empire itself had fallen. The cities he founded, from Londinium to Colonia Agrippina, grew into metropolitan centers that still thrive today as London and Cologne, tangible reminders of his lasting impact on the physical landscape of Europe. Perhaps most profoundly, Caesar represents the enduring tension between democratic governance and effective leadership that continues to challenge political systems around the world. The republic he helped destroy had become dysfunctional, corrupt, and incapable of addressing Rome's pressing problems of inequality, military expansion, and administrative complexity. His authoritarian solutions, while undermining traditional liberties and constitutional safeguards, implemented necessary reforms that the sclerotic Senate had neglected for generations. This fundamental dilemma, whether democratic systems can solve fundamental societal problems without surrendering to authoritarian figures who promise quick solutions, remains unresolved in political thought. What ultimately makes Caesar immortal is this capacity to serve as a mirror for each era's central questions about power, ambition, and the proper organization of human society. Unlike historical figures confined to their particular moment and circumstances, Caesar transcended time to become an archetype of the great man whose exceptional abilities raise fundamental questions about the proper limits of individual authority. As such, he remains not merely a historical figure to be studied and understood, but a continuing presence in humanity's ongoing dialogue about the proper balance between freedom and order, between individual excellence and collective governance. The final immortality lies not in monuments of stone that weather and crumble, but in the realm of ideas where his influence continues to shape political discourse and moral reasoning. Every debate about emergency powers in a democracy, every discussion of military authority versus civilian control, every examination of the boundary between necessary reform and dangerous revolution carries some echo of the questions raised by Caesar's extraordinary life and violent death. In this sense, he achieved precisely what he most desired: to be remembered not merely as a man who lived and died in ancient Rome, but as an inflection point in human history whose choices and their consequences continue to illuminate the eternal challenges of political life.